Easter Island sits in the southeastern Pacific Ocean like a solitary sentinel, representing one of the most isolated inhabited land masses on Earth. The nearest populated territory, Pitcairn Island, lies 1,289 miles to the west, while the Chilean coast stretches 2,300 miles eastward. This extraordinary isolation places Rapa Nui, the island's Polynesian name, in a geographic context that challenges conventional understanding of human migration and settlement patterns across the Pacific. The island's triangular shape spans approximately 63 square miles, measuring roughly 14 miles at its longest point and 7 miles at its widest. 3 extinct volcanic peaks define its corners: Rano Raraku in the southeast, Poik in the northeast, and Terevaka in the northwest, with the latter representing the highest elevation at 1,969 feet above sea level. These volcanic formations emerged from the ocean floor through hotspot volcanism between 750,000 and 110,000 years ago, creating a landmass composed primarily of basaltic rock interspersed with volcanic tuff and scoria deposits. The geological composition of Easter Island reveals a complex volcanic history that directly influenced human settlement patterns. The island's foundation consists of 3 distinct volcanic phases, each contributing unique characteristics to the landscape. The oldest formations, associated with Poik volcano, created the eastern peninsula through explosive eruptions that deposited thick layers of volcanic breccia and tuff. The central and western portions developed through subsequent volcanic activity from Rano, Raraku, and Terevaka, respectively, with the latter's shield volcano structure dominating the island's topography. Volcanic craters dot the landscape, many now transformed into freshwater lakes that served as crucial water sources for inhabitants. Rano Raraku, the quarry site of the famous moai statues, contains a crater lake surrounded by steep walls of consolidated volcanic ash. Rano Kau, the largest crater at nearly a mile in diameter, holds a shallow lake covered with floating vegetation mats. These geological features created natural boundaries and resource zones that shaped human activities across different periods of occupation. The island's soil composition varies significantly across its terrain, with fertile volcanic soils concentrated in specific areas, while other regions remain rocky and less suitable for agriculture. The western and southwestern slopes of Terevaka contain the most productive agricultural zones, where volcanic ash weathered into rich, dark soils capable of supporting intensive cultivation. Conversely, the eastern regions, particularly around Poik, present more challenging conditions with thinner soil layers and greater exposure to prevailing winds. Archaeological investigations have established human presence on Easter Island through multiple dating methodologies, including radiocarbon dating, obsidian hydration analysis, and stratigraphic excavation. The earliest confirmed evidence of human settlement dates to approximately 1200 AD, though some researchers propose earlier arrival dates based on pollen analysis and sediment cores that suggest forest clearance beginning around 900 AD. These dating discrepancies reflect the challenges inherent in establishing precise chronologies for Pacific Island colonization. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal samples from early cultural layers provides the most reliable chronological framework for human occupation. Excavations at Anahina Beach have yielded dates ranging from 1200 to 1300 AD for the earliest cultural deposits, while sites across the island show consistent occupation from this period forward. The dating methodology involves careful analysis of organic materials found in association with human artifacts, including charcoal from cooking fires, carbonized plant remains, and organic materials incorporated into construction features. Obsidian hydration dating offers an additional chronological tool specific to Easter Island's volcanic environment. The island's obsidian sources, primarily located at Rito and other volcanic outcrops, provided raw material for tool production throughout the occupation period. When obsidian surfaces are exposed through knapping or breakage, they begin absorbing atmospheric moisture at a measurable rate, creating a hydration rim whose thickness correlates with elapsed time. This technique has proven particularly valuable for dating tool manufacturing sites and establishing activity patterns across different areas of the island. The archaeological record reveals distinct phases of cultural development, each characterised by specific artefact assemblages, architectural styles, and land use patterns. The early period, spanning roughly 1200 to 1500 AD, shows evidence of initial settlement activities, forest clearance, and the establishment of agricultural systems. Material culture from this phase includes simple stone tools, basic cooking features, and the earliest ceremonial structures that would later evolve into the elaborate ahu platforms. Easter Island's original ecosystem presented both opportunities and constraints for human settlement. When Polynesian voyagers first arrived, they encountered a subtropical forest dominated by large palm trees, likely species of Jubia or similar genera, along with diverse understory vegetation including shrubs, ferns, and smaller tree species. This forest environment supported a limited but significant fauna, including several species of seabirds that nested in the trees and along coastal areas. The palm forest ecosystem provided crucial resources for early inhabitants, including palm nuts for food, palm wood for construction and tool making, and palm fibre for cordage and textiles. Archaeological evidence suggests these palms reached substantial sizes, with some specimens potentially exceeding 80 feet in height and 3 feet in diameter. The forest canopy created a complex habitat, supporting various bird species, many of which served as protein sources for the human population. Marine resources formed another critical component of the island's resource base. The surrounding Pacific waters contained numerous fish species, including tuna, mahi-mahi, and various reef fish accessible through shore-based and offshore fishing techniques. Archaeological middens reveal extensive exploitation of marine resources, with fish bones comprising significant portions of food refuse deposits throughout the occupation period. The island's rocky coastline provided habitat for shellfish, sea urchins, and other marine invertebrates that supplemented the diet. The absence of native land mammals, except for small bats, meant that Polynesian colonists needed to introduce domestic animals to establish sustainable protein sources. Archaeological evidence confirms the introduction of chickens and pigs, though the latter apparently did not establish permanent populations. Rats, whether intentionally introduced or arriving as stowaways, quickly established themselves and significantly impacted the island's ecosystem by consuming palm nuts and other vegetation. Freshwater resources on Easter Island were limited but strategically distributed across the landscape. The crater lakes provided the most reliable water sources, supplemented by seasonal streams and springs that flowed intermittently depending on rainfall patterns. The island's volcanic geology created underground water systems that emerged as springs along coastal areas and in specific inland locations. Understanding and controlling these water sources became crucial for successful habitation and influenced settlement patterns throughout the occupation period. The island's climate regime, characterised by subtropical conditions with moderate temperatures and seasonal rainfall patterns, supported both the natural ecosystem and human agricultural activities. Average temperatures range from 64 degrees Fahrenheit to 77 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the year, with minimal seasonal variation due to the maritime influence. Rainfall averages approximately 50 inches annually, though distribution varies significantly across the island due to topographic effects and prevailing wind patterns. Trade winds from the southeast dominate the island's weather patterns, creating distinct microclimates across different areas. The windward eastern and southern coasts receive higher rainfall and experience stronger winds, while the leeward western and northern areas remain relatively protected. These climatic variations influenced agricultural productivity and settlement choices, with different areas suited for specific crops and activities. Soil analysis reveals the agricultural potential that attracted and sustained human populations on Easter Island. The volcanic soils, particularly in areas receiving adequate rainfall, proved capable of supporting intensive cultivation of Polynesian crop species. Sweet potato, taro, yam, banana and sugarcane formed the foundation of the agricultural system, with each crop adapted to specific soil and climatic conditions across the island. Archaeological evidence of ancient agricultural systems includes stone mulching gardens, terraced fields, and irrigation features that maximise productivity in the island's challenging environment. These agricultural modifications represent sophisticated landscape management techniques that allowed relatively dense populations to thrive in isolation. Stone mulching in particular appears to have been extensively employed to retain soil moisture and protect crops from wind damage. The distribution of archaeological sites across Easter Island reflects the complex interaction between environmental factors and human settlement strategies. Coastal areas, particularly along the northern and western shores, contain the highest concentrations of ceremonial architecture and habitation sites, taking advantage of marine resources and relatively protected conditions. Inland areas show evidence of agricultural intensification and resource extraction activities, including quarry sites and tool manufacturing locations. Ceremonial sites, including the famous Ahu platforms and moai statues, demonstrate sophisticated understanding of the island's geography and geology. The placement of these monuments reflects careful consideration of viewsheds, astronomical alignments, and relationships to natural features. The quarry site at Rano Raraku utilised the volcanic tuff deposits that provided ideal material for statue carving, while the transportation routes between quarry and ceremonial sites reveal detailed knowledge of the island's topography. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to refine understanding of Easter Island's human occupation chronology and environmental history. Excavations at multiple sites have revealed evidence of rapid environmental change following human arrival, including forest clearance, soil erosion, and species extinctions. These findings provide crucial data for reconstructing the complex interactions between human populations and island ecosystems that shape the trajectory of Rapa Nui civilization. The archaeological record also preserves evidence of technological innovations developed in response to the island's unique environmental challenges. Stone tool technology is adapted to local raw materials, architectural techniques suited to volcanic terrain, and agricultural methods designed for isolated island conditions all demonstrate human adaptability and ingenuity. These technological developments form the foundation for understanding how Easter Island's inhabitants created one of Polynesia's most distinctive and enigmatic cultures. The arrival of humans on Easter Island represents one of the most remarkable achievements in maritime exploration and navigation in human history. The Polynesian seafarers who first reached Rapa Nui possess sophisticated knowledge systems that enable them to traverse thousands of miles of open ocean with remarkable precision, using techniques that modern navigators still struggle to fully comprehend. These master navigators developed their skills across generations of island hopping throughout the Pacific, culminating in the discovery and settlement of one of the most isolated places on Earth. Polynesian navigation relied on an intricate understanding of celestial movements, ocean swells, wind patterns, and natural indicators that formed a comprehensive wayfinding system. Star navigation formed the backbone of this knowledge, with navigators memorizing the rising and setting positions of over 200 stars and constellations. They tracked the movement of key stars throughout the night, using their positions to determine direction, latitude, and approximate location. The Southern Cross, Orion, and various other constellations served as primary reference points, while navigators learned to account for seasonal variations in stellar positions and the precession of celestial bodies. Ocean swells provided another crucial navigation tool, as experienced navigators could detect and interpret the complex patterns of wave interference created by distant land masses. Islands generate characteristic swell patterns that extend far beyond visual range, creating distinctive signatures that skilled navigators could read like a map. These swells reflect and refract around islands, creating interference patterns that indicate both the direction and approximate distance to land. Navigators learned to feel these subtle wave variations through their bodies while lying in the bottom of their vessels, detecting changes imperceptible to untrained observers. Wind patterns across the Pacific follow predictable seasonal cycles that Polynesian navigators incorporated into their route planning. The trade winds, monsoons, and seasonal wind shifts created highways and barriers that determined optimal sailing seasons and routes. Navigators understood how to exploit these wind patterns for efficient travel, while avoiding dangerous weather systems. They recognized the relationship between wind direction, cloud formations, and approaching weather changes, allowing them to make critical decisions about when to continue sailing or seek shelter. Natural indicators provided additional navigation aids that complemented astronomical and oceanographic knowledge. Seabirds offered crucial information about nearby land, as different species had known flight ranges and behavioural patterns. Frigate birds, for example, typically remain within 50 miles of land, while other species indicated different distances and directions to islands. Navigators observed bird flight patterns, particularly their evening return flights to roosting areas, which pointed toward land. They also noted changes in water colour, floating debris patterns, and the presence of land-based insects carried by offshore winds. The sophisticated navigation techniques developed by Polynesian seafarers enabled them to undertake deliberate voyages of exploration and colonisation across the vast Pacific. These were not accidental drifting expeditions, but planned ventures involving careful preparation, resource allocation, and strategic timing. Voyaging canoes carried complete colonisation packages, including domestic animals, crop plants, tools, and sufficient personnel to establish viable populations on newly discovered islands. Archaeological evidence from across Polynesia demonstrates the systematic nature of Pacific colonisation, with similar material culture assemblages appearing on islands separated by thousands of miles of ocean. The presence of identical crop species, domestic animals, and technological traditions on widely scattered islands confirms that these voyages involve deliberate transportation of complete cultural packages rather than random drift voyages by small groups. Carbon dating and stratigraphic analysis from Easter Island provide compelling evidence for Polynesian arrival around 1200 AD, though some researchers argue for earlier dates based on indirect evidence. Radiocarbon dates from the earliest cultural layers at multiple sites consistently cluster around 1200 to 1300 AD, with the most reliable dates coming from short-lived organic materials found in direct association with human artefacts. Charcoal samples from early cooking hearths, carbonized plant remains from agricultural activities, and organic materials incorporated into construction features all support this chronological framework. The dating methodology involves careful analysis of stratigraphic contexts to ensure that dated materials actually relate to human activities rather than natural processes. Archaeologists examine the association between organic materials and cultural features, looking for clear evidence that charcoal samples derive from human fires rather than natural forest fires or other non-cultural events. This rigorous approach has produced consistent dates across multiple sites, strengthening confidence in the 1200 AD arrival timeframe. Obsidian hydration dating provides additional chronological support for the archaeological sequence on Easter Island. The island's volcanic glass sources at Orito and other locations supplied raw material for tool production throughout the occupation period. When obsidian artifacts are manufactured, their surfaces begin absorbing atmospheric moisture at measurable rates, creating hydration rims whose thickness correlates with elapsed time since manufacture. This dating technique has proven particularly valuable for establishing activity sequences at tool manufacturing sites and tracking changes in lithic technology over time. Genetic studies of modern Rapa Nui people and ancient DNA analysis of skeletal remains provide crucial insights into the founding population and subsequent demographic history of Easter Island. Mitochondrial DNA analysis reveals clear Polynesian ancestry among the Rapa Nui, with specific haplogroups that trace back to populations in central and eastern Polynesia, These genetic signatures match patterns found in other Polynesian populations, confirming the cultural and archaeological evidence for Polynesian colonization. The genetic diversity present in modern Rapa Nui populations suggests that the founding group included sufficient individuals to establish a viable breeding population. Estimates based on genetic analysis indicate that the initial colonizing population likely numbered between 20 and 100 individuals, though the exact size remains uncertain due to subsequent demographic fluctuations and genetic bottlenecks. This founding population size falls within the range observed for other successful Polynesian colonizations across the Pacific. Ancient DNA analysis of pre-contact skeletal remains has revealed additional information about the biological characteristics and population history of early Easter Island inhabitants. These studies confirm Polynesian ancestry, while providing insights into health, nutrition, and demographic patterns during different periods of occupation. The skeletal evidence indicates that early populations maintained relatively good health and nutrition, suggesting successful adaptation to the island environment. Archaeological evidence reveals that early settlers established their initial settlements along the northern and western coasts of Easter Island, taking advantage of the most protected harbours and favourable environmental conditions. Anakena Beach, with its white coral sand and relatively calm waters, appears to have served as a primary landing site and early settlement area. Archaeological deposits at Anakena contain some of the earliest radiocarbon dates on the island, along with evidence of initial habitation structures and subsistence activities. The settlement pattern reflects strategic decision-making by the colonisers, who selected locations that maximised access to marine resources while providing protection from prevailing winds and rough seas. The northern coast offered the best combination of landing beaches, fresh water sources, and agricultural potential, making it the logical choice for initial settlement. From these coastal bases, the population gradually expanded inland and around the island's perimeter. Early settlement features include simple stone foundations for residential structures, cooking areas marked by fire-cracked rock concentrations, and refuse deposits containing the remains of marine and terrestrial food sources. These archaeological features provide direct evidence of daily life activities and subsistence strategies employed by the first inhabitants. The material culture from early sites includes basic stone tools, fishing equipment, and food preparation implements that reflect Polynesian technological traditions adapted to local resources. The adaptation strategies employed by Easter Island's first inhabitants demonstrate remarkable flexibility and innovation in response to the island's unique environmental challenges. Unlike other Polynesian islands with extensive reef systems and diverse marine environments, Easter Island presented a more limited marine resource base that required modified fishing strategies and greater reliance on terrestrial resources. Archaeological evidence indicates that early settlers quickly established agricultural systems based on traditional Polynesian crops adapted to local conditions. Sweet potato cultivation became particularly important, as this crop proved well suited to Easter Island's climate and soil conditions. Archaeological features associated with sweet potato cultivation include stone-lined storage pits, processing areas, and field systems that maximize productivity in the volcanic soils. The introduction and management of domestic animals formed another crucial adaptation strategy. Chickens successfully established populations on the island and became an important protein source throughout the occupation period. Archaeological evidence for chicken husbandry includes specialized stone structures that may have served as coops or breeding facilities, along with abundant chicken bones in food refuse deposits. The absence of pigs in the archaeological record suggests that this traditional Polynesian domestic animal either failed to establish viable populations or was not successfully transported to the island. Forest management and resource extraction strategies reveal sophisticated understanding of the island's ecological systems and sustainable use practices. Early inhabitants exploited the palm forest resources for construction materials, food, and fibre, while apparently attempting to maintain forest cover through selective harvesting. Archaeological evidence suggests that initial forest clearance focused on specific areas needed for agriculture and settlement, while preserving forest resources in other locations. The development of stone tool technologies adapted to Easter Island's volcanic geology demonstrates technological innovation in response to local raw material availability. The island's basalt, obsidian, and volcanic tuff provided different materials suited for specific tool functions. Basalt served for heavy-duty tools like adzes and hammerstones. Obsidian provided sharp cutting edges for knives and scrapers, and volcanic tuff proved suitable for specialized implements, including the famous moai statues. Water management strategies became crucial for successful settlement on an island with limited freshwater resources. Archaeological evidence indicates that early inhabitants developed sophisticated systems for locating, accessing, and conserving water sources. Stone-lined wells, water collection features, and storage systems maximised the utility of the island's scattered freshwater sources. The crater lakes provided the most reliable water supplies, but seasonal streams and springs required careful management to ensure year-round availability. The social organisation of early Easter Island society appears to have followed traditional Polynesian patterns while adapting to the island's specific circumstances. Archaeological evidence suggests the presence of ranked social groups with differential access to resources and specialised roles in subsistence and ceremonial activities. The distribution of early archaeological sites indicates that different groups may have controlled specific territories or resource zones, establishing the foundation for the complex social systems that later characterised Rapa Nui civilization. Early ceremonial activities, evidenced by simple stone platforms and ritual deposits, demonstrate the continuation of Polynesian religious and social traditions in the new island environment. These early ceremonial features represent the precursors to the elaborate ahu platforms and moai statues that would later dominate the island's landscape. The investment in ceremonial architecture from the earliest occupation period indicates that the colonizing population maintained strong cultural traditions while adapting to their new environment. The success of Polynesian colonization on Easter Island required not only sophisticated navigation and seafaring capabilities, but also comprehensive knowledge systems that enabled rapid adaptation to new environments. The colonizers brought with them millennia of accumulated wisdom about island colonization, including understanding of which crops would succeed in different conditions, how to establish sustainable resource management systems, and how to organize social groups for survival in isolated settings. The transformation of Easter Island's early Polynesian settlers into the sophisticated civilization that created the moai represents one of the most remarkable cultural developments in Pacific prehistory. By 1400 AD, the descendants of the original colonizers had established a complex society organized around powerful clan systems, hierarchical leadership structures, and monumental construction projects that required unprecedented levels of social coordination and technical expertise. The Rapa Nui people developed distinctive cultural institutions that channeled their collective energies toward creating some of the most iconic monuments in human history. Rapa Nui society organized itself around approximately 12 major clans, each controlling specific territories across the island and maintaining distinct genealogical traditions that trace their origins to the original settlers. These clans, known as mata, functioned as corporate groups that owned land, controlled resources, and competed for prestige through monumental construction activities. Each mata claimed descent from particular founding ancestors and maintained elaborate oral traditions that preserved their genealogical connections and territorial rights across generations. The clan territories, called kainga, encompassed defined areas that typically extended from inland regions to coastal zones, ensuring each group had access to diverse resource bases, including agricultural lands, freshwater sources, and marine exploitation areas. Archaeological mapping reveals that these territorial boundaries remained relatively stable over centuries, with each clan developing specialised knowledge about their particular environmental zones and resource management strategies. The territorial system created a framework for sustainable resource exploitation while providing the organisational foundation for large-scale construction projects. Within each clan, social stratification reflected traditional Polynesian patterns adapted to Easter Island's specific circumstances. The Ariki, or paramount chiefs, held supreme authority within their respective clans and coordinated interclan relationships through marriage alliances, ceremonial exchanges, and competitive display activities. These leaders possessed both secular authority over resource allocation and sacred power derived from their ancestral connections, making them essential figures in both practical governance and spiritual activities. Below the Ariki, a class of specialised priests known as Iwi Atua managed religious ceremonies and maintained the complex ritual knowledge associated with moai construction and ancestor worship. These religious specialists possessed detailed understanding of astronomical cycles, ceremonial protocols, and the spiritual requirements for successful monument construction. Their knowledge encompassed not only the practical aspects of organising construction projects, but also the ritual procedures necessary to ensure spiritual approval and protection for these massive undertakings. The Tangata Honui, or commoners, formed the largest social group and provided the labour force for agricultural production, fishing activities, and monument construction. Despite their lower social status, these individuals possessed sophisticated technical skills and specialised knowledge that made the moai construction projects possible. Archaeological evidence suggests that commoners organised themselves into specialised work groups with particular expertise in quarrying, carving, transportation, and platform construction activities. The engineering challenges involved in moai construction required innovative solutions that demonstrate the remarkable technical capabilities of Rapa Nui society. The primary quarry site at Ranoaraku provided the volcanic tuff that served as the raw material for approximately 95% of the island's moai. This compressed volcanic ash possessed ideal characteristics for statue carving, being soft enough to work with stone tools while maintaining sufficient structural integrity to support massive sculptures weighing up to 80 tons. Quarrying operations at Ranoaraku involved systematic extraction techniques that maximised the utility of available raw material while minimising structural damage to the quarry face. Archaeological investigation reveals that Rapa Nui quarrymen developed sophisticated understanding of the tuff's geological properties, including its stratification patterns, fracture characteristics, and weathering behaviour. They selected specific areas within the quarry that provided optimal material quality for different statue components, with harder layers used for structural elements and softer material employed for detailed carving work. The tool technology employed in moai construction demonstrates remarkable innovation within the constraints of a Stone Age technology base. Rapa Nui craftsmen manufactured their carving implements primarily from basalt, creating a diverse toolkit that included heavy percussion tools for rough shaping, medium-weight implements for intermediate carving stages, and fine tools for detailed finish work. These basalt tools, known as toki, required considerable skill to manufacture and maintain, as the hard volcanic rock demanded precise knapping techniques to create effective cutting edges. Archaeological analysis of tool assemblages from Ranoaraku reveals the sophisticated organisation of carving activities, with different areas of the quarry specialised for particular stages of the construction process. Rough shaping occurred near the quarry face where large quantities of waste material could be easily disposed of, while detailed carving took place in areas with better working conditions and access to water for tool maintenance. The distribution of different tool types across the quarry site indicates that work groups specialised in particular aspects of the carving process, creating an efficient production system that maximised both quality and output. The carving process itself followed standardised procedures that ensured consistency across the hundreds of moai produced over several centuries. Sculptors began by outlining the basic statue form on the quarry face, then systematically removed material to create the rough shape. The distinctive moai profile, with its elongated head, prominent nose and stylized features, required precise proportional relationships that Rapa Nui carvers maintained across statues of vastly different sizes. This consistency suggests the existence of formal training systems and standardized design templates that preserved artistic traditions across generations. Evidence from partially completed moai reveals the sequential stages of the carving process, from initial roughing out to progressive refinement of features and surface details. The sculptors worked from top to bottom, completing the head and upper torso before separating the statue from the quarry face. This technique allowed multiple carvers to work simultaneously on different portions of the same statue while maintaining overall design coherence. The final separation from the bedrock required careful planning to avoid structural damage, with carvers leaving temporary support pillars that were removed only after the statue achieved structural independence. The logistics of moai transportation from Ranaraku to ceremonial sites across the island presented engineering challenges that have generated extensive scholarly debate and experimental investigation. The distances involved range from less than a mile to over 11 miles, with routes crossing varied terrain including steep slopes, rough volcanic surfaces, and areas with limited clearance for manoeuvring massive stone sculptures. Archaeological evidence indicates that approximately 400 moai were successfully transported to ceremonial platforms, while nearly 900 remain at or near the quarry site. Traditional oral histories preserved among the Rapa Nui people describe the moai as walking to their destinations, a description that some researchers interpret literally as evidence for an upright transportation method. Experimental archaeology conducted by teams including Thor Heyerdahl, Joanne van Tilburg and Terry Hunt has tested various transportation theories using replica moai and traditional materials. These experiments have demonstrated the feasibility of multiple transportation methods, each with distinct advantages and limitations depending on specific circumstances. The rolling method, first tested extensively during Heyerdahl's expeditions, involves placing the moai on wooden rollers and pulling them across prepared roadways. This technique requires substantial quantities of timber for both rollers and leverage poles, along with smooth, relatively level transport routes. Experimental trials have shown that teams of 70 people can successfully move multi-ton statues using this method, though the timber requirements would have placed significant demands on the island's forest resources. Sledding represents another viable transportation option that may have been employed for moving moai across rougher terrain or during periods when timber resources became scarce. This method involves securing the statue to a wooden sledge and dragging it along prepared pathways, potentially using stone rollers in areas with suitable surfaces. Archaeological evidence for ancient roadways includes cleared corridors between Ranaraku and various ceremonial sites, with some routes showing evidence of deliberate surface preparation and obstacle removal. The walking method, demonstrated convincingly by recent experimental work, involves manipulating the statue in an upright position using rope systems that rock it forward in a controlled manner. This technique exploits the moai's distinctive shape and centre of gravity to achieve forward motion while requiring fewer people and less infrastructure than rolling or sledding methods. The experimental success of this approach has generated renewed interest in the oral traditions that describe the moai as walking to their destinations. Transportation route analysis reveals sophisticated planning that took advantage of natural terrain features while minimizing the technical challenges of moving massive stone sculptures. The ancient roadways, known as ara moai, follow carefully selected paths that avoid the steepest slopes and most difficult terrain while providing the most direct routes to ceremonial destinations. Archaeological survey has identified multiple parallel routes between major sites, suggesting that transportation planners developed alternative pathways to accommodate different circumstances or seasonal conditions. The ceremonial platforms known as ahu represent the culmination of Rapa Nui monumental architecture, serving as the final destinations for transported moai and the focal points for ancestor worship activities. These structures demonstrate engineering sophistication comparable to the moai themselves, requiring precise stone-fitting techniques, sophisticated foundation systems, and careful attention to astronomical alignments and landscape relationships. The largest Ahu platforms stretch over 200 feet in length and rise more than 15 feet above ground level, incorporating millions of carefully fitted stones in their construction. AHU construction involved multiple building phases that reflect the evolution of Rapa Nui ceremonial architecture over several centuries. Early platforms consist of relatively simple stone foundations that supported single moai, while later constructions incorporate complex internal chambers, elaborate facing stones, and sophisticated drainage systems. The construction sequence typically began with site preparation and foundation laying, followed by the erection of retaining walls and internal structural elements, and culminating with the installation of moai and final architectural details. The precision stone-fitting techniques employed in Ahu construction rival those found in other famous megalithic sites worldwide. Rapa Nui builders shaped individual stones to fit together without mortar, creating walls that have withstood centuries of seismic activity and environmental stress. The largest facing stones weigh several tons and required sophisticated lifting and positioning techniques to achieve their final placement. Archaeological analysis reveals evidence for ramp systems, lever arrangements, and coordinated team efforts that enabled the manipulation of these massive architectural elements. Ancestor worship formed the spiritual foundation that motivated and sustained the enormous investment in moai and Ahu construction across several centuries of Rapa Nui cultural development. The Rapa Nui believed that their deceased ancestors retained active involvement in the affairs of the living, providing protection, guidance, and prosperity when properly honoured through ceremonial activities and monumental construction. This belief system created powerful incentives for clans to invest their resources in increasingly elaborate monuments that demonstrated their devotion to ancestral spirits and their capacity for organising complex construction projects. The moai themselves functioned as physical manifestations of ancestral presence, with each statue representing specific deceased leaders or important clan figures. The distinctive artistic style of the moai, with their solemn expressions and inward-gazing orientation, reflects their role as eternal guardians watching over their descendants' territories. The placement of moai on Ahu platforms positioned them to oversee clan lands and provide spiritual protection for agricultural activities, residential areas, and ceremonial gatherings. Religious ceremonies conducted at Ahu sites involved elaborate protocols that honoured ancestral spirits, while reinforcing social hierarchies and clan identities. These rituals included food offerings, chanted genealogies, and competitive displays that demonstrated each clan's prosperity and spiritual connections. Archaeological evidence for ceremonial activities includes specialised cooking features, offering deposits, and artefact assemblages associated with ritual feasting and gift exchange activities. The spiritual beliefs that motivated moai construction also encompassed concepts of mana, the supernatural power that flowed through sacred objects, places, and individuals. The Rapa Nui believed that properly constructed and consecrated moai possessed mana that could influence natural forces, ensure agricultural success, and protect clan territories from spiritual and physical threats. This belief system created strong incentives for technical excellence in statue construction, as flawed or improperly made moai might fail to attract or retain the spiritual power necessary for their protective functions. Astronomical knowledge played a crucial role in Rapa Nui ceremonial activities and monument construction, with many Ahu platforms incorporating alignments to significant celestial events, including solstices, equinoxes, and the rising positions of important stars. These astronomical relationships connected the monuments to cosmic cycles that governed agricultural activities, ceremonial calendars, and spiritual observances. The integration of astronomical knowledge into monument design demonstrates the sophisticated intellectual achievements of Rapa Nui society and their understanding of the relationships between earthly and celestial phenomena. The social organisation required to sustain moai construction over several centuries represents one of the most impressive examples of collective action in prehistoric societies. Archaeological evidence suggests that major construction projects involved coordinated efforts by multiple clans, with specialised work groups contributing particular skills and resources to shared objectives. This cooperation required sophisticated leadership systems, resource allocation mechanisms, and conflict resolution procedures that enabled sustained collaboration, despite competitive relationships between different social groups. Labour organisation for moai construction involved complex scheduling systems that coordinated quarrying, carving, transportation, and platform construction activities across multiple sites simultaneously. Archaeological analysis reveals evidence for seasonal construction cycles that took advantage of optimal weather conditions while accommodating agricultural requirements and other subsistence activities. The scale of these operations required advanced planning, resource stockpiling, and coordination mechanisms that demonstrate remarkable organisational capabilities. The technical innovations developed during moai construction periods influenced other aspects of Rapa Nui material culture, including improvements in agricultural techniques, architectural methods, and craft production systems. The engineering knowledge gained through monument construction found applications in water management systems, fortification construction, and residential architecture that enhance the overall quality of life for island inhabitants. These technological developments represent lasting legacies of the moai construction period that continue to benefit Rapa Nui society, even after monumental building activities declined. The conventional archaeological narrative of Easter Island's development, while supported by substantial evidence, has not satisfied all researchers and theorists seeking to explain the remarkable achievements of Rapa Nui civilization. Beginning in the 1960s, alternative explanations emerged that challenged orthodox interpretations of moai construction, transportation, and placement, proposing instead that the island's monuments required technological capabilities far beyond those available to Polynesian societies. These unconventional theories, ranging from ancient astronaut hypotheses to lost civilization scenarios, have generated significant public interest while sparking intense academic debate about the limits of human achievement in prehistoric contexts. Erich von Daniken's groundbreaking 1968 work Chariots of the Gods introduced Easter Island to a global audience as potential evidence for extraterrestrial intervention in human affairs. Von Daniken argued that the technical precision and massive scale of moai construction exceeded the capabilities of Stone Age societies, requiring advanced technology that could only have been provided by visiting extraterrestrial beings. His analysis focused on several key anomalies that, in his view, conventional archaeology failed to adequately address. The remarkable uniformity of moai features across centuries of production, the precision of statue placement and astronomical alignments, and the logistical impossibility of moving multi-ton sculptures across difficult terrain using primitive methods. Von Daniken's extraterrestrial hypothesis drew particular attention to the distinctive appearance of the moai themselves, arguing that their elongated heads, prominent eyes, and solemn expressions represented attempts by primitive artists to depict visiting space travelers wearing helmets or breathing apparatus. He noted that similar elongated head motifs appeared in ancient art from various global locations, suggesting a worldwide pattern of extraterrestrial contact that left consistent artistic evidence across different cultures. The standardized proportions and facial features of Easter Island's moai, according to this interpretation, resulted from Rapa Nui artists copying the appearance of actual extraterrestrial visitors, rather than developing these forms through indigenous artistic traditions. The ancient astronaut theory gained additional support from researchers who identified alleged technological anomalies in moai construction that seemed to require capabilities beyond Stone Age societies. Giorgio Tsoukalos, a prominent proponent of ancient astronaut theories, has argued that the precision of moai carving demonstrates knowledge of advanced sculptural techniques that prehistoric peoples could not have developed independently. He points to the mathematical precision of statue proportions, the sophisticated understanding of structural engineering required to create stable multi-ton sculptures, and the apparent standardization of production methods across the entire construction period as evidence for technological guidance from advanced beings. Proponents of extraterrestrial involvement have also focused on the mysterious pukao, the red scoria cylinders that crown approximately 100 moai at various ceremonial sites across the island. These cylindrical stone caps, some weighing up to 12 tons, required separate quarrying operations at Punapau Crater and independent transportation to moai locations. Ancient astronaut theorists argue that the pukao represent technological devices rather than ceremonial headdresses, possibly depicting helmets, communication equipment, or energy collection apparatus used by visiting extraterrestrials. The precision required to balance these massive cylinders atop completed moai suggests, according to this interpretation, the use of advanced lifting technology unavailable to prehistoric societies. The transportation of moai from Rano-Raraku quarry to ceremonial sites across the island has generated particularly intense speculation about possible extraterrestrial assistance. Despite experimental demonstrations of various transportation methods using traditional materials and techniques, some researchers maintain that the logistics of moving nearly 400 multi-ton statues across rough volcanic terrain exceeded the organizational and technological capabilities of isolated Polynesian communities. David Childress, author of numerous books on ancient mysteries, has suggested that the moai transportation problem can only be solved by invoking advanced technology, possibly including anti-gravity devices or other exotic propulsion systems that enabled the statues to be moved with minimal effort. Ancient astronaut proponents have identified several specific features of moai transportation that they argue support extraterrestrial involvement. The absence of wear patterns on many transported moai suggests to these researchers that the statues never actually contacted the ground during movement, implying levitation or other advanced transportation methods. The survival of delicate surface details and projecting elements on transported statues indicates, according to this interpretation, that conventional dragging or rolling methods would have caused damage that is not observed on the actual monuments. The apparent randomness of statue abandonment along transportation routes has been interpreted as evidence for sudden technological failure or departure of extraterrestrial assistance. Astronomical alignments incorporated into Easter Island's ceremonial architecture have provided additional fuel for ancient astronaut theories, with some researchers arguing that the precision of these alignments required advanced astronomical knowledge unavailable to prehistoric societies. Robert Bauval, known for his work on astronomical alignments in ancient Egyptian monuments, has suggested that Easter Island's Ahu platforms incorporate sophisticated celestial relationships that demonstrate knowledge of precession, stellar coordinates, and complex astronomical cycles. According to this interpretation, the astronomical precision of Rapa Nui monuments indicates guidance from technologically advanced beings with superior understanding of celestial mechanics. The placement of moai in relationship to astronomical phenomena has been interpreted by some researchers as evidence for extraterrestrial communication systems or navigational aids. William Corliss, compiler of anomalous archaeological data, has noted that certain moai groupings appear to mark specific stellar rising points or celestial events with precision that exceeds what might be expected from societies lacking advanced instruments. The consistent orientation of platform-mounted moai toward inland areas, rather than the ocean, has been interpreted as evidence that these monuments served functions related to sky observation or communication with aerial visitors rather than traditional ancestor worship activities. Alternative theories about Easter Island's development have also emerged from researchers who, while rejecting extraterrestrial explanations, argue that conventional archaeology underestimates the technological capabilities of ancient civilizations. Graham Hancock, author of Fingerprints of the Gods, has proposed that Easter Island preserves evidence of a lost advanced civilization that possessed sophisticated engineering knowledge, subsequently forgotten during periods of cultural collapse. According to this interpretation, the technical achievements of Rapa Nui society represent the survival of ancient knowledge systems rather than independent Polynesian innovations. The lost civilization hypothesis draws support from geological evidence suggesting that Easter Island may have experienced significant environmental changes during the period of human occupation. Hancock and other researchers argue that rising sea levels following the last ice age may have submerged coastal areas that contained evidence of earlier, more advanced settlements. The current archaeological record, according to this view, represents only the final phase of a much longer and more complex cultural sequence that included periods of technological sophistication subsequently lost due to environmental catastrophe or social collapse. Proponents of advanced ancient civilization theories point to specific technical achievements on Easter Island that they argue exceed the capabilities typically attributed to Polynesian societies. The precision of stone fitting in ahu construction, the sophisticated understanding of structural engineering demonstrated in platform design, and the mathematical relationships incorporated into moai proportions all suggest, according to this interpretation, access to advanced technical knowledge. The apparent standardization of construction techniques across centuries of building activity indicates the existence of formal technical education systems that preserved and transmitted complex engineering knowledge across generations. The Rongorongo script of Easter Island has provided additional evidence for researchers arguing for advanced ancient civilizations. This unique writing system, consisting of hieroglyphic-like symbols carved on wooden tablets, represents the only known example of independent script development in Polynesia. Some researchers argue that the complexity and sophistication of Rongorongo indicates cultural contact with advanced civilizations possessing formal writing systems, possibly including ancient South American societies or even more distant cultures with sophisticated intellectual traditions. Archaeological evidence for possible transoceanic contact between Easter Island and South America has generated theories about advanced maritime civilizations that facilitated long-distance cultural exchange during prehistoric periods. The presence of sweet potato, a South American domesticate, in pre-contact Polynesian societies demonstrates that some form of contact occurred across the Pacific. Researchers including Thor Heyerdahl argued that this contact involved advanced South American civilizations with sophisticated navigation capabilities that enabled regular voyages to Polynesian islands. DNA studies revealing traces of South American ancestry in some Polynesian populations have strengthened arguments for significant prehistoric contact between these regions. While mainstream archaeology attributes this contact to Polynesian voyaging capabilities, alternative researchers suggest that advanced South American civilizations possessed maritime technologies that enabled them to reach Easter Island and other Pacific islands. The megalithic construction techniques employed in Rapa Nui monuments show similarities to South American architectural traditions, particularly in Peru and Bolivia, suggesting possible technological transfer between these regions. The precision of astronomical alignments in Easter Island's ceremonial architecture has been compared to similar phenomena at other ancient sites worldwide, leading some researchers to propose the existence of a global network of advanced civilizations sharing sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Sites including Stonehenge, the Giza pyramids, Angkor Wat, and various South American monuments all demonstrate precise astronomical alignments that require advanced understanding of celestial mechanics. The global distribution of these phenomena suggests to some researchers the existence of an ancient civilization with worldwide influence that transmitted advanced knowledge to various regional cultures. Recent discoveries using ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies have revealed previously unknown subsurface features on Easter Island that some researchers interpret as evidence for more complex ancient civilizations than previously recognized. These investigations have identified buried structures, possible underground chambers, and subsurface anomalies that may represent architectural features not visible through conventional archaeological methods. While mainstream archaeology interprets these findings as evidence for previously unknown aspects of known Rapa Nui culture, alternative researchers suggest they may represent remains of earlier, more advanced civilizations. The apparent sophistication of Easter Island's ancient agricultural systems has also attracted attention from researchers proposing advanced prehistoric civilizations. Archaeological evidence reveals complex irrigation systems, terraced field networks, and soil management techniques that maximized agricultural productivity in challenging environmental conditions. Some researchers argue that these agricultural innovations demonstrate knowledge of soil science, hydrology, and ecological management that exceeds what might be expected from isolated Polynesian communities, suggesting influence from more advanced civilizations. Geological anomalies on Easter Island have provided additional material for alternative theories about the island's prehistoric development. Some researchers have identified unusual rock formations, possible artificial modifications to natural features, and geological patterns that they interpret as evidence for advanced engineering projects. These features, according to alternative interpretations, may represent remains of ancient construction projects that employed technologies more sophisticated than those typically attributed to Polynesian societies. The decline of Easter Island's moai construction activities has been interpreted by some alternative researchers as evidence for the departure of extraterrestrial visitors or the collapse of contact with advanced civilizations. The relatively sudden cessation of statue production around 1500 AD, followed by apparent cultural changes and population decline, suggests to these theorists that external technological assistance was withdrawn, leaving the Rapa Nui unable to continue their monumental construction projects. The subsequent development of the Birdman cult and changes in ceremonial practices represent, according to this interpretation, attempts to maintain contact with departed advanced beings or to preserve fragments of lost technological knowledge. Modern attempts to replicate moai construction and transportation using traditional methods have generated mixed results that continue to fuel alternative theories about Easter Island's prehistoric development. While experimental archaeology has successfully demonstrated various techniques for carving, moving and erecting moai using Stone Age technology, some researchers argue that these experiments fail to account for the full complexity and scale of the original construction projects. The time, labour, and resource requirements revealed through experimental work suggest to these critics that the historical construction program would have exceeded the capabilities of the estimated prehistoric population, requiring either larger populations than archaeologically documented or assistance from advanced technologies. The discovery of Easter Island's unique Rongorongo script represents one of the most significant yet frustrating archaeological puzzles in Pacific prehistory. When European missionaries first encountered these mysterious wooden tablets covered in intricate hieroglyphic symbols during the 1860s, they stumbled upon what appeared to be the only indigenous writing system ever developed in Polynesia. The script consists of hundreds of distinct symbols arranged in precise horizontal lines across wooden boards, creating a visual record that has defied comprehensive decipherment despite more than 150 years of scholarly investigation. Brother Eugene Araud, a French Catholic missionary who arrived on Easter Island in 1864, provided the first European documentation of Rongorongo tablets in his correspondence with church authorities. Araud described finding wooden boards covered with hieroglyphic characters in nearly every house he visited, noting that the islanders treated these objects with considerable reverence. His initial reports indicated that the Rapa Nui people could still read portions of the script, though this knowledge appeared to be rapidly disappearing due to population decline and cultural disruption following European contact. The systematic collection and documentation of Rongorongo tablets began in earnest during the 1870s when Bishop Tepano Jausin of Tahiti acquired several specimens and attempted to record their contents with the assistance of Rapa Nui informants. Jausin's work with Matoro Tawaura, a Rapa Nui man living in Tahiti, produced the first extensive transcriptions of Rongorongo texts, though these recordings proved problematic due to language barriers and possible misunderstandings about the script's function. Matoro's interpretations described the symbols as representing various natural phenomena, genealogical information, and ceremonial chants, but the accuracy of these translations remains highly disputed among modern scholars. The physical characteristics of Rongorongo tablets reveal sophisticated woodworking techniques and careful attention to the script's visual presentation. The tablets, known as Kohau Rongorongo in the Rapa Nui language, were carved from driftwood or locally available timber using shark teeth and obsidian tools. The scribes created shallow grooves to form the individual symbols, working with remarkable precision to maintain consistent character sizes and spacing across entire tablets. The largest surviving tablet, known as the Santiago staff, measures over 4 feet in length and contains more than 2,300 individual symbols arranged in 63 lines of text. The symbols themselves display extraordinary artistic sophistication and standardization that suggests formal training systems for Rongorongo scribes. Each character occupies a roughly rectangular space and incorporates elements representing human figures, birds, fish, plants, geometric forms, and abstract designs. The human figures appear in various poses and configurations, sometimes holding objects or interacting with other elements within the same symbol. Bird motifs include frigate birds, terns, and other species identifiable through their distinctive anatomical features, while marine creatures encompass fish, turtles, and octopi rendered with careful attention to biological accuracy. The directional reading pattern of Rongorongo follows a unique system called reverse boustrophedon, where alternate lines are inverted and read in opposite directions. This means that readers would begin at the bottom left corner of a tablet, read the first line from left to right, then rotate the tablet 180 degrees and read the second line from left to right in the inverted orientation. This process continues throughout the text, creating a serpentine reading path that requires constant manipulation of the tablet. No other known writing system employs this particular reading method, making Rongorongo unique among the world's scripts. Early attempts at decipherment focused on identifying recurring symbol patterns and comparing Rongorongo to other hieroglyphic writing systems, particularly Egyptian hieroglyphs and Chinese characters. Catherine Routledge, who conducted extensive ethnographic research on Easter Island during 1914 to 1915, collected additional information about Rongorongo from elderly Rapa Nui informants who claimed to remember fragments of the script's meaning. Her work documented the ceremonial contexts in which Rongorongo tablets were traditionally used, including recitation performances during religious festivals and the formal training of young men in the script's interpretation. The German ethnologist Thomas Barthel made significant advances in Rongorongo research during the 1950s and 1960s by creating the first comprehensive catalogue of Rongorongo symbols and developing systematic methods for analysing the script's structure. Barthel identified approximately 600 distinct symbols and established a standardised numbering system that remains in use among Rongorongo researchers today. His statistical analysis revealed that certain symbols appear with much greater frequency than others, suggesting that the script might function as a syllabic or logographic system rather than a purely pictographic one. Barthel's work also identified several tablets that appeared to contain similar textual content, indicating that Rongorongo might preserve standardized compositions rather than unique individual documents. The Mamari tablet and the Aruku Karenga tablet, for example, share substantial portions of identical symbol sequences, suggesting that these texts might represent different versions of the same traditional composition. This discovery implied that Rongorongo functioned as a mnemonic system for preserving oral traditions, rather than as a tool for creating original written documents. Russian linguist Yuri Knorosov, famous for his breakthrough decipherment of Maya hieroglyphs, applied his expertise to Rongorongo during the 1960s and proposed that the script represented a mixed writing system combining logographic and syllabic elements. Knorosov identified potential phonetic indicators within the symbol inventory and suggested that certain signs functioned as determinatives that clarified the meaning of adjacent symbols. His analysis revealed structural similarities between Rongorongo and other ancient writing systems, particularly in the use of compound symbols that combined multiple semantic and phonetic elements. The discovery of the lunar calendar hypothesis represented a major breakthrough in Rongorongo research, when William Liller identified astronomical content within several tablets during the 1980s. Liller's analysis of the Mamari tablet revealed symbol sequences that appeared to correspond with lunar months and calendar calculations, suggesting that at least some Rongorongo texts functioned as astronomical records. His work identified symbols that might represent different phases of the moon, seasonal markers, and ceremonial dates tied to agricultural and religious cycles. Jacques Guy's computational analysis of Rongorongo during the 1990s employed statistical methods borrowed from cryptography and comparative linguistics to identify structural patterns within the script. Guy's research revealed that Rongorongo symbol sequences follow statistical distributions similar to those found in natural languages, supporting the hypothesis that the script represents genuine linguistic content rather than purely decorative or magical symbols. His work also identified potential morphological markers that might indicate grammatical relationships between different parts of Rongorongo texts. The development of computer-assisted analysis techniques has enabled more sophisticated approaches to Rongorongo decipherment, with researchers creating digital databases that facilitate pattern recognition and statistical analysis across the entire corpus of surviving tablets. These computational methods have revealed previously unnoticed structural relationships between different texts and identified recurring formulaic expressions that might represent standardized phrases or ceremonial formulas. The digital analysis has also enabled more precise measurement of symbol frequencies and distributions, providing quantitative data for testing various decipherment hypotheses. Recent epigraphic analysis by Konstantin Pozniakov has proposed that Rongorongo represents a purely logographic system where each symbol corresponds to a complete word or concept rather than phonetic values. Pozniakov's work suggests that the script functioned primarily as a memory aid for trained reciters who used the visual symbols to trigger recall of extensive oral compositions. According to this interpretation, the symbols served as prompts for traditional chants, genealogies, and ceremonial texts that were primarily preserved through oral tradition rather than written documentation. The limited number of surviving Rongorongo artifacts has severely hampered decipherment efforts, with only 26 objects containing authentic Rongorongo inscriptions currently known to exist. Many of these tablets are fragmentary or poorly preserved, reducing the available textual corpus to approximately 15,000 individual symbols distributed across various museums and private collections worldwide. This small sample size makes statistical analysis difficult and prevents researchers from identifying the full range of symbol variations and contextual uses that would be necessary for comprehensive decipherment. The cultural disruption that followed European contact eliminated most of the traditional knowledge associated with Rongorongo, creating an additional obstacle for modern decipherment efforts. The devastating population decline that reduced the Rapa Nui population from an estimated 4,000 people to fewer than 200 by the 1870s resulted in the loss of the specialized knowledge required to read and interpret the script. The few surviving informants who worked with early researchers possessed only fragmentary knowledge of Rongorongo, and their interpretations often contradicted each other, or appeared to reflect creative improvisation rather than authentic traditional knowledge. Alternative theories about Rongorongo's origins and purpose have emerged from researchers who question the conventional assumption that the script developed independently on Easter Island. Some scholars have proposed that Rongorongo represents a post-contact phenomenon inspired by European writing systems, arguing that the script's apparent sophistication exceeds what might be expected from an isolated Polynesian society. According to this interpretation, Rapa Nui scribes created Rongorongo as an attempt to imitate European literacy after observing Spanish or other European documents during early contact periods. The post-contact hypothesis draws support from the absence of clear archaeological evidence for Rongorongo tablets predating European arrival, though the perishable nature of wood makes such evidence unlikely to survive in Easter Island's tropical environment. Proponents of this theory argue that the script's complexity and standardization suggest rapid development during the historical period, rather than gradual evolution over centuries of indigenous use. They point to similar phenomena in other Pacific societies, where contact with European literacy inspired the development of indigenous writing systems within relatively short time periods. However, the majority of Rongorongo researchers reject the post-contact hypothesis based on several lines of evidence that support indigenous development. The script's unique structural characteristics, including its reverse Boustrophedon reading pattern and distinctive symbol inventory, differ fundamentally from any European writing system that Rapa Nui people might have encountered. The integration of Rongorongo symbols with traditional Rapa Nui artistic motifs and the script's apparent connection to pre-contact ceremonial practices suggest genuine indigenous origins, rather than European inspiration. The extraterrestrial hypothesis for Rongorongo's origins has attracted attention from ancient astronaut theorists, who argue that the script's sophistication indicates contact with technologically advanced beings. Proponents of this interpretation point to the script's unique characteristics as evidence that it represents an attempt to record information received from extraterrestrial visitors. According to this theory, the complex symbol system and standardized writing conventions reflect knowledge transmission from advanced beings who possess sophisticated communication technologies. Erich von Daniken and other ancient astronaut theorists have suggested that certain Rongorongo symbols depict technological devices or astronomical phenomena that would have been unknown to prehistoric Polynesian societies. They interpret symbols showing human figures with enlarged heads or unusual appendages as representations of spacesuited extraterrestrials, while geometric symbols might represent technological diagrams or star maps. The apparent astronomical content identified in some tablets supports, according to this interpretation, the hypothesis that Rongorongo preserves information about celestial navigation or cosmic phenomena provided by visiting space travelers. The standardization of Rongorongo symbols across different tablets has been cited by alternative researchers as evidence for external technological influence in the script's development. They argue that the remarkable consistency of symbol forms and proportions suggests the use of standardized templates or mechanical reproduction methods unavailable to Stone Age societies. The precision of symbol execution and the mathematical relationships between different character elements indicate, according to this interpretation, access to advanced design principles that required technological assistance to implement. Giorgio Tsoukalos and other proponents of ancient astronaut theories have focused on Rongorongo's unique reading system as evidence for extraterrestrial influence. They argue that the reverse Boustrophedon pattern represents an alien communication protocol that differs from naturally developed human writing systems. The requirement for constant tablet rotation during reading suggests, according to this interpretation, that the script was designed for beings with different physical orientations or technological reading devices rather than human users. The apparent mathematical content within some Rongorongo texts has attracted attention from researchers proposing advanced prehistoric knowledge systems. Analysis of symbol frequencies and distributions reveals numerical patterns that might represent sophisticated mathematical concepts, including prime numbers, geometric relationships, and astronomical calculations. Some alternative researchers argue that these mathematical elements indicate access to advanced knowledge systems that exceeded the typical capabilities of Polynesian societies, possibly through contact with technologically superior civilizations. The global distribution of similar symbolic systems has led some researchers to propose connections between Rongorongo and other ancient scripts found in various parts of the world. Similarities between certain Rongorongo symbols and characters found in Indus Valley script, Easter Islands petroglyphs, and various South American symbolic systems suggest, according to this interpretation, the existence of ancient cultural contacts that facilitated the transmission of writing technologies across vast distances. These researchers argue that Rongorongo represents a local adaptation of a widespread symbolic tradition, rather than an independent Pacific invention. Recent discoveries of previously unknown Rongorongo inscriptions have provided new material for decipherment efforts, while raising additional questions about the script's distribution and use. Petroglyphic versions of Rongorongo-like symbols have been identified at several locations across Easter Island, suggesting that the script might have been more widely used than previously recognised. These rock art examples display symbols similar to those found on wooden tablets, though their dating and relationship to the tablet tradition remains unclear. The application of artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques to Rongorongo analysis represents the most recent frontier in decipherment research. Computer algorithms trained on known writing systems have been applied to Rongorongo symbol sequences to identify potential linguistic patterns and structural relationships. While these computational approaches have revealed interesting statistical patterns within the script, they have not yet produced convincing translations or identified clear phonetic values for individual symbols. The cultural significance of Rongorongo within traditional Rapa Nui society appears to have extended beyond simple record-keeping to encompass important ceremonial and educational functions. Ethnographic accounts describe Rongorongo recitation as a specialized skill requiring years of training and practice, with expert reciters holding important positions within the social hierarchy. The tablets themselves were treated as sacred objects that required special handling and storage procedures, suggesting that the script possessed spiritual as well as practical significance for the Rapa Nui people. The demographic trajectory of Easter Island reveals a complex pattern of population growth, territorial expansion, and eventual decline that fundamentally shaped the development of Rapa Nui civilization. Archaeological evidence suggests that the initial Polynesian settlement around 1200 AD involved a founding population of approximately 50 to 100 individuals, representing multiple family groups with sufficient genetic diversity to establish a viable breeding population. This modest beginning would eventually expand into a sophisticated society, numbering several thousand inhabitants at its peak during the 15th and early 16th centuries. Population reconstruction based on archaeological site density, residential structure counts, and agricultural capacity estimates indicates rapid demographic expansion during the first 2 centuries of settlement. The favourable environmental conditions encountered by early settlers, including abundant marine resources, fertile volcanic soils, and extensive palm forests, supported sustained population growth rates that may have approached 2 to 3% annually during optimal periods. This expansion rate would have doubled the population approximately every 35 years, creating the demographic foundation necessary for the labour-intensive monument construction projects that characterise later Rapa Nui civilization. Settlement pattern analysis reveals that population growth proceeded through systematic territorial expansion from initial coastal bases toward inland areas and around the island's perimeter. The earliest sites cluster along the northern and western coasts, particularly around Ananakina Beach and the Hangaroa area, where favourable landing conditions and fresh water sources provided optimal settlement locations. Archaeological dating of residential sites shows progressive expansion inland along major valleys and toward the island's central regions as population pressure increased and available coastal territories became saturated. The demographic peak of Easter Island's population likely occurred between 1400 and 1600 AD, when archaeological evidence suggests the island supported between 6,000 and 15,000 inhabitants. This population estimate derives from calculations based on the carrying capacity of documented agricultural systems, the number of residential structures identified through archaeological survey, and comparative data from similar Polynesian societies. The wide range in population estimates reflects uncertainties about household sizes, agricultural productivity levels, and the proportion of the island actually under cultivation during peak periods. Territorial organisation during the population maximum reveals a sophisticated system of clan-based land management that divided the island into distinct zones controlled by different matter or lineage groups. Each clan territory typically extended from coastal areas to inland regions, ensuring access to diverse resource bases including marine exploitation zones, agricultural lands, and freshwater sources. Archaeological mapping has identified approximately 12 major territorial divisions, each encompassing between 2,000 and 8,000 acres, depending on environmental quality and resource availability. The boundaries between clan territories followed natural landscape features, including ridgelines, stream valleys, and volcanic formations that provided clear demarcation lines, while reflecting the practical requirements of resource management. Stone walls and boundary markers reinforced these territorial divisions in areas where natural features proved insufficient for clear demarcation. Archaeological evidence indicates that these territorial boundaries remained relatively stable over several centuries, suggesting successful resolution of potential conflicts over land rights and resource access. Resource management systems within each clan territory demonstrated sophisticated understanding of sustainable exploitation practices adapted to Easter Island's limited and isolated environment. Agricultural zones were carefully managed through crop rotation, fallow periods, and soil enhancement techniques that maintained productivity over extended periods. Marine resources were exploited through seasonal restrictions, gear limitations, and territorial agreements that prevented overexploitation of critical fish populations and shellfish beds. The distribution of freshwater sources across clan territories reveals strategic considerations that influence both territorial boundaries and internal settlement patterns. Each major clan controlled at least one reliable water source, whether crater lakes, seasonal streams, or spring locations. The most powerful clans controlled territories that included multiple water sources or access to the largest crater lakes at Rano Raraku and Reino Kau. Water rights and access agreements between neighbouring clans required sophisticated negotiation and enforcement mechanisms that reflected the critical importance of fresh water in the island's arid environment. Social stratification within Rapa Nui society became increasingly pronounced as population density increased and competition for resources intensified. The Ariki or paramount chiefs consolidated power through control of agricultural surpluses, coordination of monument construction projects, and management of interclan relationships. These leaders possessed both secular authority over resource allocation and sacred power derived from genealogical connections to founding ancestors and spiritual forces that govern natural phenomena. Below the paramount chiefs, a class of secondary leaders known as tangata honui managed specific aspects of clan activities including agricultural production, fishing operations, and craft specialization. These individuals possessed technical expertise in particular domains and served as intermediaries between the paramount chiefs and common clan members. Archaeological evidence suggests that secondary leaders controlled larger residential compounds and possessed greater quantities of prestige goods, including imported materials and specialized tools. The emergence of craft specialization reflects the increasing social complexity that accompanied population growth and territorial consolidation. Specialized groups developed expertise in statue carving, platform construction, tool manufacturing, and other technical activities that required extensive training and access to particular raw materials. The concentration of specialized activities at specific locations, such as the moai quarries at Ranuraraku and the tool manufacturing sites near obsidian sources, indicates the development of production systems that served island-wide rather than purely local needs. Competition between clans intensified as population growth strained the island's resource base, and territorial expansion reached physical limits imposed by the island's finite size. Archaeological evidence for competitive monument construction includes the progressive increase in moai sizes and the elaboration of ceremonial platforms that demonstrated each clan's capacity for organising large-scale construction projects. The investment of enormous labour resources in non-productive ceremonial activities suggests that prestige competition became a driving force in Rapa Nui society, even as practical resource constraints increased. Evidence for organised warfare and violent conflict appears in the archaeological record around 1500 AD, coinciding with the apparent cessation of moai construction and significant changes in settlement patterns. Fortified sites known as puna appear on prominent hilltops and defensible locations, featuring stone walls, defensive ditches, and restricted access routes that indicate organised military activities. The construction of these fortifications required substantial labour investment and strategic planning that suggests warfare had become a significant concern for Rapa Nui communities. Weapon assemblages from late prehistoric contexts include spears tipped with obsidian points, clubs fashioned from hardwood, and sling stones manufactured from volcanic rock. The standardization of weapon forms and the presence of large quantities of projectile points at fortified sites indicate that warfare involved organized military units, rather than individual conflicts. Archaeological evidence suggests that these weapons were designed specifically for combat against human opponents, rather than hunting or other subsistence activities. The distribution of fortified sites across the island reveals strategic considerations that reflect the territorial organisation of Rapa Nui society during periods of conflict. Major fortifications control key transportation routes, water sources, and agricultural areas that would have been crucial for maintaining clan territories under hostile conditions. The positioning of defensive sites also suggests coordination between allied clans and strategic planning that extended beyond individual territorial boundaries. Settlement pattern changes during the conflict period indicate significant population movements and defensive reorganisation that disrupted earlier territorial arrangements. Coastal settlements, previously favoured for their access to marine resources and transportation routes, were largely abandoned in favour of inland locations that offered better defensive positions. Residential sites from this period cluster around fortified locations and show evidence of rapid construction using expedient materials and techniques. Archaeological evidence for destruction and abandonment at many ceremonial sites suggests that warfare specifically targeted the monumental architecture that symbolised clan prestige and spiritual power. Moai were deliberately toppled from their platforms, ceremonial structures were dismantled, and sacred sites were defaced in ways that appear to reflect systematic attempts to destroy the spiritual foundations of enemy clans. The scale and thoroughness of this destruction indicates organised campaigns rather than opportunistic raiding or individual acts of vandalism. Material culture changes during the conflict period reflect both the practical requirements of defensive living and the disruption of traditional craft production systems. Pottery production, which had been a specialised activity concentrated at particular locations, became more dispersed as communities sought to reduce dependence on trade relationships that might be disrupted by warfare. Tool production shifted toward expedient technologies that could be quickly manufactured from locally available materials, rather than the specialised implements that characterised earlier periods. Housing structures during the late prehistoric period show significant changes from earlier architectural traditions, with defensive considerations taking precedence over comfort and status display. Residential buildings became smaller, more dispersed, and often incorporated defensive features including thick walls, restricted entrances, and concealed storage areas. The elaborate stone foundations and carefully fitted masonry that characterized earlier residential architecture gave way to expedient construction techniques using readily available materials. Daily life during the conflict period involved significant changes in subsistence strategies, social organisation, and cultural practices that reflected the challenges of maintaining community cohesion under conditions of chronic warfare. Agricultural activities required armed protection and coordination to prevent disruption by raiding parties. Fishing and marine resource exploitation became more dangerous as coastal areas became contested zones where enemy groups might launch surprise attacks. The organisation of food production and distribution systems during the conflict period reveals adaptive strategies that communities developed to maintain subsistence security under hostile conditions. Food storage became more important as communities needed to prepare for potential sieges or disruptions to normal production activities. Archaeological evidence indicates the construction of concealed storage facilities and the development of preservation techniques that extended the shelf life of agricultural products. Social relationships within communities appear to have become more egalitarian during the conflict period, as traditional status distinctions became less relevant under survival conditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that prestige goods and status symbols became less important as communities focused on practical necessities for defence and subsistence. The elaborate ceremonial activities that had characterised earlier periods were replaced by more pragmatic concerns about security and resource management. The role of women in Rapa Nui society during the conflict period appears to have expanded beyond traditional domestic activities to include participation in defensive activities and resource management. Archaeological evidence from fortified sites includes tools and artefacts associated with female activities, suggesting that entire communities, including women and children, occupied defensive positions during periods of heightened conflict. The presence of food processing equipment and domestic artefacts at fortified sites indicates that these locations served as permanent residential areas rather than temporary refuges. Religious and ceremonial activities underwent significant changes during the conflict period, as traditional practices associated with ancestor worship and monument construction became impractical under defensive conditions. The emergence of the Birdman cult during this period represents a fundamental shift in Rapa Nui religious practices toward competitive rituals that emphasized individual achievement rather than collective monument construction. Archaeological evidence suggests that Birdman ceremonies took place at Orongo Ceremonial Village, which was constructed during the late prehistoric period specifically for these new religious activities. The demographic decline that characterized the final phase of prehistoric Rapa Nui civilization reflects the cumulative impact of warfare, environmental degradation, and resource depletion on the island's carrying capacity. Population estimates for the period immediately preceding European contact suggest that the island's inhabitants had declined to perhaps 2,000, 3,000 individuals, representing a significant reduction from peak population levels. This decline appears to have been gradual rather than catastrophic, occurring over several generations as environmental and social stresses accumulated. Archaeological evidence for population decline includes the abandonment of marginal agricultural areas, the reduction in settlement site sizes, and changes in material culture that reflect decreased craft specialization and reduced trade relationships between different areas of the island. The concentration of late prehistoric settlements in a few favoured locations suggests that communities consolidated around the most productive and defensible areas while abandoning territories that had become difficult to maintain under changed conditions. The transformation of Easter Island from a thriving civilization capable of monumental construction projects to a society locked in perpetual warfare represents one of the most dramatic societal collapses documented in Pacific prehistory. By 1500 AD, the same communities that had coordinated the carving and transportation of nearly 1,000 moai found themselves engaged in systematic destruction of their own cultural achievements, toppling the very monuments that had defined their civilization for over 3 centuries. This collapse emerged from a complex interaction of environmental degradation, resource competition, and social breakdown that fundamentally altered the trajectory of Rapa Nui society. The deforestation of Easter Island proceeded at an accelerating pace throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, driven by the competing demands of monument construction, agricultural expansion, and daily subsistence needs. Pollen analysis from sediment cores extracted from the island's crater lakes reveals a dramatic decline in palm pollen beginning around 1300 AD, with complete disappearance of large tree species by approximately 1650 AD. This forest destruction occurred systematically across the entire island, eliminating an estimated 16 million palm trees along with dozens of other plant species that had comprised the original ecosystem. The palm trees that dominated Easter Island's original landscape served multiple critical functions that became irreplaceable once the forest disappeared. These massive trees, some reaching heights of 80 feet with trunk diameters exceeding 3 feet, provided the timber necessary for constructing the rollers, levers, and sledges required for moai transportation. Archaeological analysis of tool marks on transported statues indicates that wooden implements played essential roles in moving these multi-ton sculptures across the island's rough terrain. The loss of large timber sources effectively ended the ability to transport newly carved moai from Raraku quarry to ceremonial sites across the island. Beyond their role in monument construction, the palm forest provided crucial resources for daily life, including palm nuts that served as a dietary staple, palm fibre used for cordage and textiles, and construction timber for residential buildings and canoe construction. The nuts from these palms contained high concentrations of fats and carbohydrates that supplemented the limited protein sources available on the isolated island. Archaeological middens from early occupation periods contain abundant palm nut shells, indicating their importance in the traditional diet. As the forest disappeared, communities lost access to these critical food resources, forcing greater reliance on agricultural production and marine exploitation. The destruction of the forest canopy eliminated nesting sites for numerous seabird species that had provided important protein sources for the human population. Archaeological analysis of food refuse deposits shows a dramatic decline in bird bone frequencies after 1400 AD, corresponding with the period of intensive deforestation. Species including frigate birds, boobies, and various petrels abandoned their traditional nesting areas as suitable habitat disappeared. The loss of these marine birds removed a renewable protein source that had sustained the population during seasonal fluctuations in fish availability and agricultural productivity. Soil erosion accelerated dramatically following forest clearance, as the root systems that had previously stabilised volcanic soils were eliminated across large areas of the island. Without tree cover to intercept rainfall and moderate surface water flow, seasonal storms carved deep gullies through agricultural areas and carried away the fertile topsoil that had accumulated over centuries of volcanic weathering. Archaeological evidence indicates that many previously productive agricultural areas became unusable for cultivation, as erosion removed the soil layers necessary for crop production. The impact of deforestation on moai transportation capabilities became evident through the abandonment of nearly 400 completed statues along the roads leading from Raraku quarry to ceremonial sites across the island. These abandoned moai, many showing evidence of careful preparation for transport, represent projects that were initiated but could not be completed once timber resources became unavailable. The distribution of abandoned statues correlates directly with the distance from the quarry, indicating that transportation became progressively more difficult as forest resources were depleted and alternative methods proved inadequate for moving the larger sculptures. Archaeological evidence for the intensification of warfare appears throughout the island during the 15th and 16th centuries, marked by dramatic changes in settlement patterns, architectural styles, and material culture assemblages. The construction of fortified refuges known as puna represents a fundamental shift from the open, residential patterns that had characterized earlier periods. These defensive sites occupied naturally defensible positions, including hilltops, narrow ridges, and areas surrounded by cliffs or steep slopes that provided protection against organized attacks. The fortification at Poik Peninsula exemplifies the sophisticated defensive strategies developed during the conflict period. This massive earthwork consists of a stone wall and ditch system that cuts across the narrow neck connecting the peninsula to the main island, creating a defendable refuge for several hundred people. The wall construction required moving thousands of tons of stone and earth, representing a labour investment comparable to major ceremonial projects from earlier periods. Archaeological investigation reveals that the fortification incorporated multiple defensive lines, hidden storage areas, and protected water sources that would have enabled extended resistance against besieging forces. Obsidian weapon production increased dramatically during the conflict period, with specialised workshops producing standardised spear points, knives, and other implements designed specifically for warfare against human opponents. The obsidian sources at Orito became intensively exploited, with archaeological evidence indicating round-the-clock production activities that generated enormous quantities of waste flakes and broken tools. Analysis of weapon assemblages reveals sophisticated understanding of fracture mechanics and tool design that maximise the effectiveness of volcanic glass implements in combat situations. The matara, distinctive obsidian spear points with elongated triangular blades, represent the most characteristic weapons of the warfare period. These implements required considerable skill to manufacture, involving careful pressure flaking techniques that created sharp edges along the entire perimeter of the blade. Archaeological experiments have demonstrated that matara points could penetrate traditional Polynesian armour and inflict serious wounds, making them effective weapons for the close-quarters combat that characterised interclan warfare on the confined island environment. Evidence for systematic destruction of ceremonial architecture appears across the island during the late prehistoric period, with nearly all moai deliberately toppled from their platforms and many ahu structures partially dismantled. The toppling of moai required coordinated efforts by organised groups, as these multi-ton statues needed to be carefully undermined or pulled over to avoid damaging the platforms beneath them. Archaeological analysis indicates that the destruction followed consistent patterns, with statues typically pushed forward off their platforms rather than being randomly damaged or vandalised. The symbolic significance of moai destruction extended beyond mere military tactics to encompass fundamental attacks on the spiritual foundations of enemy clans. In traditional Rapa Nui belief systems, the moai served as repositories of ancestral mana that protected clan territories and ensured agricultural fertility. By toppling enemy moai, attacking groups sought to eliminate the spiritual protection that these monuments provided, while demonstrating their own power to overcome traditional religious sanctions. The systematic nature of this destruction suggests that it formed a central component of warfare strategy, rather than incidental damage from military operations. Archaeological evidence from destroyed ceremonial sites reveals that the dismantling of ahu platforms involved selective removal of specific architectural elements rather than random destruction. The carefully fitted facing stones that formed the visible exterior of the platforms were systematically removed and often reused in construction of defensive fortifications. This recycling of ceremonial stonework for military purposes represents a fundamental reorientation of community priorities, from monument construction to defensive preparation. The breakdown of traditional social structures becomes evident through changes in residential architecture, craft production systems, and material culture distributions that reflect the collapse of the hierarchical organisation that had characterised earlier Rapa Nui society. Elite residential compounds with their elaborate stone foundations and specialised architectural features were abandoned in favour of smaller, more dispersed dwellings that offered better concealment and defensive advantages. The standardised architectural styles that had reflected clan identity and social status gave way to expedient construction techniques using whatever materials remained available. Craft specialisation, which had reached sophisticated levels during the monument construction period, largely disappeared as communities focused on immediate survival needs rather than prestige production. The specialised toolmaking workshops that had supplied high-quality implements for statue carving and platform construction were abandoned as demand shifted toward weapons production and basic subsistence equipment. Archaeological evidence indicates that many specialised techniques for stoneworking, wood carving and textile production were lost during this period as the social systems that had supported craft specialists collapsed. The redistribution networks that had previously moved resources and finished goods between different areas of the island broke down as territorial boundaries became militarised and inter-community trade became dangerous. Archaeological analysis reveals that communities became increasingly self-sufficient during the conflict period, producing their own tools, weapons and other necessities, rather than relying on exchange relationships with neighbouring groups. This economic fragmentation reduced the overall efficiency of resource utilisation, while increasing the vulnerability of individual communities to local resource failures. Population decline during the collapse period reflects both the direct casualties of warfare and the indirect effects of reduced agricultural productivity, resource scarcity, and social disruption. Demographic estimates based on settlement site abandonment and changes in material culture distributions suggest that the island's population may have declined by 50 to 70% between 1500 and 1650 AD. This population reduction occurred gradually over several generations as the cumulative effects of environmental degradation and social conflict reduced the island's carrying capacity. The abandonment of marginal agricultural areas provides clear evidence for population decline and resource concentration around the most productive remaining territories. Archaeological survey reveals that upland agricultural zones and areas with thin soils were systematically abandoned during the conflict period as communities concentrated around the most reliable water sources and fertile agricultural areas. This territorial consolidation reduced the total area under cultivation, while increasing competition for access to the remaining productive lands. Skeletal evidence from late prehistoric burials indicates increased nutritional stress and higher rates of violent trauma compared to earlier periods. Analysis of bone chemistry reveals dietary changes that suggest reduced access to marine protein sources and increased reliance on terrestrial plant foods. The presence of healed fractures and embedded weapon points in skeletal remains provides direct evidence for the intensity of interpersonal violence during the collapse period. The emergence of cannibalism during the final phases of prehistoric Rapa Nui civilization represents the ultimate breakdown of traditional social constraints and cultural taboos. Archaeological evidence for human consumption includes cut marks on human bones, evidence of marrow extraction, and cooking modifications that indicate systematic processing of human remains for food. The presence of human bone fragments in cooking areas and refuse deposits suggests that cannibalism became a regular practice rather than an isolated response to extreme circumstances. The social fragmentation that accompanied the collapse period is reflected in the abandonment of large-scale ceremonial activities and the emergence of smaller, more localised ritual practices. The elaborate festivals and interclan gatherings that had characterised earlier periods became impossible to maintain under conditions of chronic warfare and resource scarcity. Archaeological evidence indicates that ceremonial activities became focused on smaller community groups and emphasised immediate practical concerns rather than the long-term spiritual and social integration that had motivated earlier monument construction. The development of the Birdman cult during the late prehistoric period represents a fundamental transformation of Rapa Nui religious practices from collective ancestor worship to competitive individual achievement. The annual Birdman ceremony, centred at the Orongo ceremonial village on the rim of Ranokau crater, involved dangerous swimming competitions to offshore islets, where participants attempted to collect the first sooty tern egg of the nesting season. This new religious focus emphasised individual prowess and risk-taking rather than the collective labour organisation that had characterised moai construction activities. Archaeological investigation of Orongo village reveals construction techniques and architectural styles that differ significantly from earlier ceremonial sites, reflecting the changed social and environmental conditions of the collapse period. The stone houses at Orongo were built using readily available materials and expedient construction techniques, rather than the carefully fitted masonry that characterised earlier Ahu platforms. The village's defensive position on a narrow ridge between Ranokau crater and steep coastal cliffs reflects the security concerns that dominated late prehistoric Rapa Nui society. The transformation of Easter Island's political organisation during the collapse period involved the emergence of warrior leaders who gained power through military success rather than traditional genealogical authority. Archaeological evidence suggests that these new leaders established control over strategic resources, including freshwater sources, defensive positions, and remaining agricultural areas. The concentration of weapons and defensive architecture around certain sites indicates the development of militarized power centers that differed fundamentally from the ceremonial centers that had dominated earlier political organization. Resource competition intensified as environmental degradation reduced the total productivity of the island's ecosystems, while population pressure remained high. The elimination of forest resources forced greater reliance on agricultural production and marine exploitation, creating increased competition for access to the most productive territories. Archaeological evidence indicates that conflicts often focused on control of freshwater sources, fertile agricultural areas, and strategic positions that controlled access to marine resources. The social memory of the monument construction period appears to have been deliberately suppressed during the collapse, as communities sought to distance themselves from the cultural traditions that had led to environmental destruction and social conflict. The oral traditions recorded by early European visitors contain few detailed references to the techniques and organisation of moai construction, suggesting that this knowledge was either lost or intentionally forgotten during the traumatic transition to the warfare period. This cultural amnesia represents a fundamental break with the ancestral traditions that had defined Rapa Nui identity for over 3 centuries. The morning of April 5th, 1722, marked a pivotal moment in Pacific exploration when Dutch navigator Jacob Roggeveen, commanding 3 vessels of the West India Company, sighted an unknown landmass rising from the vast expanse of the southeastern Pacific. Roggeveen's expedition, originally intended to locate the hypothetical southern continent Terra Australis, had been sailing westward from the Chilean coast for several weeks when lookouts aboard his flagship Arend spotted what appeared to be a small island on the western horizon. The timing of this discovery on Easter Sunday prompted Roggeveen to name the landmass Pash Eiland, or Easter Island, establishing the European designation that would persist alongside the indigenous name Rapa Nui. Roggeveen's 3 ships, the Arend Tienhoven and Afrikaanse Galley, approached the island cautiously, as Pacific navigation in the early 18th century remained fraught with dangers from uncharted reefs, unpredictable currents and hostile inhabitants. The expedition's primary mission involved commercial reconnaissance for the Dutch West India Company, which sought new trading opportunities and potential colonial territories in the Pacific region. Roggeveen carried specific instructions to document any inhabited islands, assess their commercial potential, and establish peaceful contact with indigenous populations whenever possible. The initial European observations of Easter Island revealed a landscape that confounded contemporary understanding of Pacific island societies. Roggeveen's journal entries describe a barren, treeless terrain dominated by grasslands and scattered volcanic formations, with no visible forests or significant vegetation that might support a substantial population. This environmental assessment puzzled the Dutch explorers, who expected Pacific islands to display the lush tropical vegetation characteristic of other Polynesian territories they had encountered during their westward voyage. The most extraordinary discovery awaited the Europeans as they approached the island's coastline and began to discern massive stone figures positioned along the shore. Roggeveen's detailed accounts describe his astonishment at observing what appeared to be enormous statues standing in rows along the coastal areas, their imposing forms clearly visible even from considerable distances offshore. The Dutch navigator noted that these monuments appeared to be carved from dark stone and stood with remarkable uniformity, suggesting sophisticated engineering capabilities that seemed inconsistent with the island's apparently limited resources. European estimates of the island's population varied significantly among different members of Roggeveen's expedition, reflecting both the challenges of accurate observation from offshore positions and the dispersed settlement patterns that characterized post-collapse Rapa Nui society. Roggeveen himself estimated the population at approximately 2,000 to 3,000 inhabitants, while other expedition members provided figures ranging from 1,500 to 4,000 people. These population assessments proved remarkably accurate when compared to modern archaeological estimates for the early contact period, suggesting that European observers possessed reasonable skills for demographic evaluation despite their limited time ashore. The physical appearance of the Rapa Nui people encountered by Roggeveen's expedition provided European audiences with their first detailed descriptions of Easter Island's inhabitants. Dutch accounts describe a population displaying typical Polynesian physical characteristics, including medium to tall stature, muscular builds adapted to maritime activities, and skin coloration ranging from light brown to darker tones depending on individual exposure to the tropical sun. The Europeans noted particular attention to body decoration, including extensive tattooing patterns that covered significant portions of many individual skin surfaces with intricate geometric and figural designs. Roggeveen's observations of Rapa Nui material culture revealed a society that had adapted to severe resource limitations while maintaining sophisticated technological traditions. The Dutch noted the absence of large watercraft, observing only small reed boats that appeared inadequate for significant ocean voyaging. This observation particularly puzzled European explorers, who wondered how the island's inhabitants had originally arrived without substantial seagoing vessels. The apparent contradiction between sophisticated monument construction and limited maritime technology would continue to perplex European observers for decades following initial contact. The clothing and ornamental traditions observed by Dutch expedition members reflected both the island's limited resources and the creative adaptations developed by Rapa Nui communities. European accounts describe garments fashioned primarily from bark, cloth and plant fibres, with some individuals wearing elaborate headdresses constructed from feathers, shells and carved ornaments. The quality and sophistication of these decorative items impressed European observers, who noted the intricate craftsmanship involved in creating complex ornamental assemblages from locally available materials. Technological observations by Roggeveen's expedition revealed a society operating entirely within Stone Age parameters, yet capable of remarkable engineering achievements. The Dutch noted the absence of metal tools or weapons, observing instead sophisticated implements manufactured from volcanic glass, basalt, and other local stone sources. European accounts describe observing Rapa Nui individuals using obsidian knives with remarkable sharpness and efficiency, along with various specialized tools adapted to specific functions, including fishing, agriculture, and craft production. The agricultural systems observed during the brief European visit demonstrated intensive land use practices adapted to the island's challenging environmental conditions. Dutch accounts describe extensive field systems covering significant portions of the island's interior, with evidence of sophisticated soil management techniques, including stone mulching and terracing. European observers noted the cultivation of sweet potatoes, bananas, sugarcane, and other crops that appeared well adapted to local conditions, though they commented on the apparent scarcity of certain food resources that were abundant on other Pacific islands. Religious and ceremonial observations by Roggeveen's expedition provided Europeans with their first glimpses of post-collapse Rapa Nui spiritual practices. Dutch accounts describe witnessing fire ceremonies conducted near the massive stone statues, with participants demonstrating what appeared to be reverent behaviour toward these monuments. European observers noted that the Rapa Nui people seemed to treat the statues as sacred objects, conducting rituals that involved offerings, chanted recitations, and coordinated group activities that suggested organised religious practices. The moai themselves presented the most bewildering aspect of Easter Island culture to European observers, who struggled to understand how such massive monuments could have been created and positioned by a society possessing only Stone Age technology. Roggeveen's detailed measurements indicate that the largest visible statues exceeded 30 feet in height, with proportional bulk that suggested weights far beyond the lifting capabilities of traditional human labour. The precision of carving and the standardised artistic style across numerous monuments indicated sophisticated planning and execution that seemed inconsistent with the limited population and resources evident on the island. European attempts to understand moai construction methods led to various theories about their creation and purpose, though the brief duration of initial contact prevented detailed investigation. Some Dutch observers suggested that the statues might represent ancient work by a more advanced civilization that had subsequently declined or disappeared. Others proposed that the monuments served astronomical or navigational functions, noting their consistent orientations and positions relative to prominent landscape features. The apparent contradiction between the sophistication of the moai and the limited resources available to their creators generated extensive speculation among European intellectuals following Roggeveen's return. The Dutch accounts described an island population that seemed to possess detailed knowledge about the monument's history and significance, yet lacked the technological capabilities that would have been necessary for their construction. This paradox would continue to influence European interpretations of Easter Island culture for centuries following initial contact. Roggeveen's expedition remained at Easter Island for only a single day, limiting opportunities for detailed cultural observation and preventing the establishment of sustained contact with Rapa Nui communities. The brief duration of this initial encounter reflected both the practical limitations of 18th century Pacific navigation and the cautious approach adopted by European explorers when encountering unknown populations. Dutch accounts indicate that while initial contacts appeared peaceful, underlying tensions and communication difficulties prevented the development of extended interactions. The linguistic barriers encountered during first contact severely limited European understanding of Rapa Nui culture and social organisation. Dutch expedition members possessed no knowledge of Polynesian languages and relied entirely on gesture-based communication, supplemented by the exchange of trade goods. This communication limitation prevented Europeans from obtaining detailed information about the island's history, the construction methods used for the moai, or the social systems that governed contemporary Rapa Nui society. Trade interactions during Roggeveen's visit revealed Rapa Nui interest in European manufactured goods, particularly metal implements and textiles that were unavailable through local production. Dutch accounts describe successful exchanges of iron nails, cloth fragments, and other European items for local products, including carved ornaments, plant fibre cordage, and food items. These trade activities proceeded peacefully and suggested that Rapa Nui people possessed sophisticated understanding of exchange relationships and value assessment. The departure of Roggeveen's expedition left Easter Island once again isolated in the vast Pacific. though European knowledge of its existence would eventually attract additional visitors seeking to solve the mysteries of its remarkable monuments. Dutch charts and navigational records from the expedition provided sufficient detail for future expeditions to relocate the island, establishing Easter Island's position within the expanding network of European Pacific exploration. Spanish interest in Easter Island emerged from broader imperial concerns about Pacific territorial claims and the need to secure strategic positions along trans-Pacific trade routes. The expedition of Felipe González de Ajedo in 1770 represented Spain's attempt to assert formal sovereignty over the island, while conducting more detailed investigations of its population and resources. González arrived with two vessels, the San Lorenzo and Santa Rosalia, carrying instructions to claim the island for the Spanish crown and establish formal diplomatic relations with its inhabitants. The Spanish expedition spent 6 days at Easter Island, significantly longer than Roggeveen's brief visit, allowing for more detailed observations of Rapa Nui culture and more extensive interaction with the local population. González's accounts provide the first systematic European documentation of Easter Island's political organisation, describing what appeared to be a hierarchical society with recognised leaders who possessed authority over different territorial divisions. Spanish observers noted that certain individuals received deferential treatment from other community members, suggesting the persistence of traditional leadership structures despite the social disruptions of the collapse period. Spanish attempts to establish formal diplomatic relations with Easter Island's inhabitants led to an elaborate ceremony in which González claimed the island for Spain, while Rapa Nui leaders participated in what they apparently understood as a reciprocal agreement. The Spanish accounts describe a formal gathering involving several hundred Rapa Nui people, with recognised leaders stepping forward to engage in ceremonial exchanges with European officials. Spanish interpreters attempted to explain the concept of Spanish sovereignty, though communication barriers prevented clear understanding of the political implications involved in this encounter. The territorial claims established by González's expedition included detailed mapping of the island's coastline, documentation of prominent landmarks, and formal naming of various geographic features according to Spanish conventions. These cartographic activities represented the first systematic European survey of Easter Island's geography and provided navigational references that would facilitate future visits by Spanish and other European expeditions. The Spanish charts proved particularly valuable for subsequent visitors, as they identified safe landing areas and freshwater sources that were essential for successful shore operations. Spanish observations of moai construction sites provided Europeans with their first detailed accounts of the quarrying and carving techniques used to create these monuments. González's expedition included individuals with stoneworking experience who examined the Rano Raraku quarry site and documented evidence for the tools and methods employed in statue production. Spanish accounts describe partially completed moai that revealed the sequential stages of the carving process, providing insights into the technical procedures used by Rapa Nui sculptors. The Spanish documentation of Rapa Nui religious practices expanded European understanding of the spiritual beliefs that motivated monument construction and continue to influence contemporary ceremonial activities. González's accounts describe observing elaborate rituals conducted at various Ahu platforms, with participants demonstrating complex ceremonial protocols that involve coordinated group activities, chanted recitations, and the presentation of offerings to the moai. These observations suggested that the monuments retained active religious significance, despite the apparent decline in new construction activities. British interest in Easter Island emerged from the broader context of Pacific exploration associated with Captain James Cook's voyages and the Royal Navy's systematic mapping of Pacific waters. Cook's brief visit in 1774 during his second Pacific voyage provided British audiences with their first authoritative account of Easter Island's culture and geography, written with the scientific precision that characterised Enlightenment-era exploration narratives. Cook's expedition approached Easter Island with specific scientific objectives, including astronomical observation, natural history collection, and ethnographic documentation that reflected the systematic approach adopted by British Pacific exploration. The expedition included trained observers with experience in Pacific Island cultures, enabling more sophisticated analysis of Rapa Nui society than had been possible during earlier European visits. Cook's accounts provide detailed descriptions of material culture, social organisation, and technological capabilities that established Easter Island's position within comparative studies of Pacific societies. The British assessment of Easter Island's strategic and commercial potential proved largely negative, as Cook's expedition found limited resources and no obvious opportunities for profitable trade relationships. British accounts describe an island population that possessed few goods of interest to European markets and limited capacity for sustained commercial exchange. This assessment influenced subsequent British policy toward Easter Island, which received minimal attention from imperial authorities focused on more promising Pacific territories. French involvement in Easter Island exploration reflected the competitive nature of 18th century Pacific exploration, as French expeditions sought to establish their nation's presence in regions being actively investigated by British, Spanish, and Dutch navigators. The expedition of Jean-François de Gallo, Comte de La Pérouse, in 1786, represented France's most significant early contact with Easter Island, though this visit was brief and primarily focused on navigational and geographic documentation rather than detailed cultural investigation. French scientific approaches to Easter Island study emphasised systematic observation and documentation that reflected Enlightenment intellectual traditions. La Pérouse's expedition included trained naturalists and artists who produced detailed illustrations of moai, landscape features, and cultural artefacts that provided European audiences with visual documentation of the island's distinctive characteristics. These artistic records proved particularly valuable for subsequent researchers, as they preserved detailed information about the appearance and condition of monuments during the early contact period. The cumulative impact of early European visits on Rapa Nui society proved significant despite the brief duration of individual encounters and the limited scope of direct interaction between Europeans and islanders. The introduction of new diseases, even through minimal contact, appears to have contributed to population decline that was already underway due to internal conflicts and resource limitations. European accounts from successive visits document apparent reductions in population and changes in settlement patterns that suggest ongoing demographic stress. Cultural changes observed during successive European visits indicate that Rapa Nui society adapted rapidly to the new realities created by contact with European technology and ideas. The introduction of metal tools, even in small quantities, appears to have influenced traditional craft production techniques and may have contributed to changes in monument construction and maintenance activities. European accounts document increasing interest in metal implements and growing sophistication in evaluating the relative value of different European trade goods. The European documentation of Easter Island during the early contact period established a baseline for understanding Rapa Nui culture that would prove invaluable for subsequent research, though these early accounts also reflected the limitations and biases of 18th century European perspectives on Pacific Island societies. The emphasis on monument construction and the apparent contradiction between sophisticated architecture and limited contemporary resources dominated European interpretations, while other aspects of Rapa Nui culture received less systematic attention. The systematic exploitation of Easter Island's population began in earnest during the 1860s, when Peruvian slave raiders launched devastating attacks that would fundamentally alter the demographic and cultural landscape of Rapa Nui. These raids, conducted between 1862 and 1863, represented one of the most catastrophic events in Pacific Island history, removing approximately 1,500 individuals from an estimated total population of 3,000 to 4,000 people. The Peruvian operations targeted Easter Island as part of a broader campaign to secure forced labour for the guano mines and cotton plantations along the South American coast, where indigenous workers were desperately needed to extract the valuable bird droppings that served as fertiliser for international markets. The first major raid occurred in December 1862 when 8 Peruvian vessels arrived simultaneously at different points around Easter Island's coastline, coordinating their assault to prevent escape and maximise the capture of able-bodied individuals. The raiders employed sophisticated tactics that suggested careful advance planning, including the use of gifts and trade goods to lure Rapa Nui people to coastal areas where they could be more easily captured. Peruvian accounts describe the systematic nature of these operations, with different ships assigned to specific sections of the coastline, while armed parties moved inland to capture individuals who attempted to flee to the island's interior. The demographic impact of the slave raids proved catastrophic for Rapa Nui society, as the Peruvians specifically targeted the most capable and knowledgeable members of the population. The raiders prioritised young adults, skilled craftsmen, and individuals who appeared to hold positions of authority within traditional social structures. This selective removal eliminated much of the island's leadership class and destroyed the knowledge transmission systems that had preserved traditional cultural practices across generations. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the sudden abandonment of residential sites and the disruption of agricultural activities that had sustained the remaining population. Among those captured during the raids were King Kai McCoy and his son Morata, along with numerous other traditional leaders whose removal effectively decapitated the existing political structure of Rapa Nui society. The loss of these paramount chiefs eliminated the institutional knowledge necessary for maintaining traditional governance systems and conducting the ceremonial activities that had continued to provide social cohesion despite the earlier period of internal conflict. The capture of ritual specialists and keepers of oral traditions resulted in the permanent loss of vast amounts of cultural knowledge, including genealogical records, ceremonial protocols, and historical narratives that had been preserved through oral transmission for centuries. The conditions endured by captured Rapa Nui people in Peruvian labour camps represented a form of systematic brutality that decimated the enslaved population within months of their arrival on the South American mainland. Contemporary accounts describe overcrowded barracks, inadequate food supplies, and exposure to diseases against which Pacific Islanders had no immunity. The guano extraction operations required workers to labour in extremely hazardous conditions, breathing toxic dust and working with minimal safety equipment in environments that proved lethal to individuals unaccustomed to such industrial activities. International pressure, primarily from French and British diplomatic representatives, eventually forced Peru to acknowledge the illegality of the slave raids and agree to repatriate surviving captives to Easter Island. However, the repatriation process proved nearly as devastating as the original captures, as the return voyage exposed the weakened survivors to additional diseases including smallpox that spread rapidly through the confined shipboard environment. Of the approximately 1,500 individuals originally captured, fewer than 100 survived to reach Easter Island, and many of these died shortly after arrival from diseases contracted during their captivity. The cultural devastation wrought by the slave raids extended far beyond the immediate demographic impact, as the loss of knowledge bearers created permanent gaps in traditional practices that could never be fully reconstructed. The Rongorongo script, already declining in use during the pre-contact period, became effectively extinct as the few remaining individuals who possessed reading knowledge either died in captivity or succumbed to disease following repatriation. Archaeological evidence suggests that many ceremonial sites were abandoned during this period, as the reduced population lacked the personnel necessary to maintain traditional ritual practices. The arrival of Catholic missionaries on Easter Island in 1864 marked the beginning of systematic efforts to transform Rapa Nui culture according to European religious and social models. Brother Eugene Eyraud, representing the Congregation of the Sacred Hearts, established the first permanent European presence on the island and immediately began efforts to convert the remaining population to Christianity. Eyraud's mission operated under extremely challenging conditions, as the recent slave raids had left the population traumatized and suspicious of foreign intentions, while the missionary himself struggled with isolation, limited supplies, and communication barriers that prevented effective evangelization. The conversion process proceeded gradually as Eyraud and subsequent missionaries learned rudimentary Rapa Nui language skills and began to understand local social structures. The missionaries discovered that traditional religious practices had already been severely disrupted by the demographic catastrophe of the slave raids, creating opportunities for Christian teachings to fill spiritual voids left by the collapse of indigenous ceremonial systems. The destruction of traditional leadership structures also eliminated much of the organised resistance that might have opposed missionary activities under normal circumstances. Missionary efforts to eliminate traditional religious practices involved systematic campaigns against indigenous ceremonial activities, the destruction of religious artefacts, and the prohibition of traditional festivals and gatherings. Catholic authorities viewed Rapa Nui spiritual practices as pagan superstitions that needed to be completely eradicated before genuine Christian conversion could occur. Archaeological evidence from missionary period sites reveals the deliberate destruction of traditional religious objects and the conversion of sacred sites to Christian purposes, including the construction of churches and chapels at locations previously used for indigenous ceremonies. The introduction of Christian marriage customs, burial practices, and social regulations fundamentally altered traditional Rapa Nui family structures and community organisation. Missionaries insisted on monogamous marriage relationships conducted according to Catholic ritual, eliminating traditional Polynesian marriage practices that had included polygamy and complex kinship arrangements. The imposition of European burial customs replaced traditional practices that had involved elaborate ceremonial protocols and specific relationships between the living and deceased members of clan groups. Educational activities conducted by missionary personnel focused primarily on religious instruction supplemented by basic literacy training in the Latin alphabet. The missionaries viewed traditional oral education systems as obstacles to Christian conversion and worked systematically to replace indigenous knowledge transmission with European pedagogical methods. This educational transformation contributed to the loss of traditional cultural knowledge, while failing to provide Rapa Nui people with skills that would prove useful for navigating the changing political and economic circumstances they would face during the colonial period. The establishment of missionary authority on Easter Island coincided with broader changes in Pacific colonial administration, as European powers consolidated control over Polynesian territories. The French protectorate over Tahiti, established in 1842, provided a model for Catholic missionary activities throughout eastern Polynesia, while the growing influence of Chilean interests in the southeastern Pacific created additional pressures for formal colonial control over Easter Island. These broader geopolitical developments would ultimately determine the political future of Rapa Nui, despite the preferences of its indigenous inhabitants. Chilean interest in Easter Island emerged from strategic concerns about Pacific territorial claims and the potential value of the island as a naval station or agricultural colony. Chilean naval expeditions during the 1860s and 1870s conducted systematic surveys of the island's resources and assessed its potential for supporting permanent settlements. These investigations revealed limited immediate economic value but identified Easter Island's strategic importance for controlling shipping routes between South America and Asia, particularly as steamship technology made regular trans-Pacific voyages increasingly feasible. The formal annexation of Easter Island by Chile occurred on September 9, 1888, when Captain Policarpo Toro signed an agreement with Rapa Nui leaders that ceded sovereignty over the island to the Chilean government. The circumstances surrounding this agreement remain controversial, as the Rapa Nui representatives may not have fully understood the implications of the sovereignty transfer, and the document was prepared entirely in Spanish, without adequate translation into the indigenous language. The Chilean interpretation of the agreement assumed complete territorial control, while Rapa Nui understanding may have envisioned a more limited arrangement that preserved indigenous authority over internal affairs. The implementation of Chilean administrative control proceeded gradually as government officials established bureaucratic structures and legal frameworks that incorporated Easter Island into the Chilean national system. The appointment of Chilean administrators, the establishment of official residence requirements, and the imposition of Chilean civil law created new institutional frameworks that superseded traditional Rapa Nui governance systems. These administrative changes eliminated the remaining vestiges of indigenous political autonomy and subjected the Rapa Nui people to legal and regulatory systems developed for continental Chilean society. Land tenure policies implemented by Chilean authorities fundamentally altered traditional relationships between Rapa Nui people and their ancestral territories. The Chilean government claimed ownership of all land on the island and subsequently leased large portions to private companies for sheep ranching operations. This privatization of traditional clan territories eliminated indigenous land rights and forced the Rapa Nui population into a small designated area around Hanga Roa village, effectively creating a reservation system that restricted their movement and access to traditional resource areas. The establishment of sheep ranching operations under the management of the Williamson Balfour Company transformed Easter Island's landscape and economy, while further marginalising the indigenous population. The company imported thousands of sheep that grazed across areas previously used for traditional agriculture and ceremonial activities, creating environmental pressures that altered the island's ecosystem and eliminated many indigenous plant species. The ranching operations required minimal labour from the local population, providing few economic opportunities for Rapa Nui people, while generating profits that flowed primarily to Chilean and international investors. Administrative policies during the early Chilean period reflected broader colonial attitudes that viewed indigenous populations as obstacles to modernisation and economic development. Chilean officials implemented regulations that restricted Rapa Nui movement, controlled their economic activities, and limited their access to education and political participation. These policies effectively created a system of internal colonialism that maintained the Rapa Nui people as a marginalised minority within their own ancestral territory while facilitating the exploitation of island resources by outside interests. The cultural preservation efforts that emerged during the colonial period reflected both indigenous resistance to cultural assimilation and the recognition by some European observers that traditional Rapa Nui knowledge possessed significant scholarly value. Despite official policies that discouraged traditional practices, some Rapa Nui individuals continued to maintain elements of indigenous culture through clandestine activities and informal knowledge transmission. These preservation efforts proved crucial for maintaining cultural continuity during periods of intense assimilationist pressure. The work of ethnographers and anthropologists who visited Easter Island during the late 19th and early 20th centuries contributed to documentation efforts that preserved important information about traditional Rapa Nui culture. Researchers including Catherine Routledge, Alfred Matroux, and Sebastian Englert conducted systematic studies that recorded oral traditions, documented material culture, and collected artifacts that might otherwise have been lost. These scholarly activities provided valuable resources for later cultural revival efforts, while contributing to international awareness of Easter Island's unique cultural heritage. Traditional artistic practices survived the colonial period through the adaptation of indigenous techniques to new materials and market demands. Rapa Nui woodcarvers continued to practice their craft by creating tourist souvenirs and decorative objects that incorporated traditional motifs while appealing to European aesthetic preferences. These commercial adaptations enabled the preservation of carving skills and artistic knowledge, while providing limited economic opportunities for indigenous craftsmen operating within the constraints of the colonial economy. Language preservation efforts faced particular challenges as Spanish became the dominant language of education, administration, and economic activity on Easter Island. The Rapa Nui language survived primarily through informal household transmission and community interactions, though its vocabulary and grammatical structures were increasingly influenced by Spanish linguistic patterns. The loss of specialized terminology related to traditional activities and the absence of formal education in the indigenous language created ongoing challenges for maintaining linguistic continuity across generations. Religious syncretism emerged as Rapa Nui people adapted Christian teachings to incorporate elements of traditional spiritual beliefs and practices, while missionary authorities succeeded in eliminating overt expressions of indigenous religion. Many traditional concepts and ceremonial elements persisted in modified forms that could coexist with Catholic orthodoxy. This religious blending created unique cultural expressions that preserved aspects of traditional spirituality while accommodating the requirements of Christian conversion. The maintenance of genealogical knowledge proved particularly important for preserving Rapa Nui cultural identity during the colonial period, as clan relationships and ancestral connections provided foundations for community organisation that transcended the imposed administrative structures. Despite the loss of many traditional knowledge keepers during the slave raids, surviving community members worked to reconstruct and preserve genealogical information that maintained connections to pre-contact social systems and territorial relationships. Traditional ecological knowledge related to marine resources, agricultural techniques, and environmental management survived in modified forms, as Rapa Nui people adapted to the changed circumstances of the colonial period. While large-scale traditional agriculture became impossible under the sheep ranching regime, individuals maintained small-scale cultivation practices and continued to exploit marine resources using traditional techniques supplemented by introduced technologies. This ecological knowledge would prove valuable for later efforts to restore traditional land use practices and environmental management systems. The persistence of traditional place names and geographical knowledge reflected the deep connections between Rapa Nui people and their ancestral landscape despite the political and economic changes imposed by colonial administration. The preservation of indigenous toponymy maintained cultural connections to specific locations and their associated historical and spiritual significance, providing foundations for later efforts to reclaim traditional territorial relationships and cultural practices. The transformation of Easter Island research during the late 20th and early 21st centuries has revolutionized understanding of Rapa Nui civilization through the application of sophisticated technologies and interdisciplinary methodologies that were unavailable to earlier generations of scholars. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted since the 1990s have revealed extensive subsurface features across the island, including buried architectural elements, hidden chambers beneath existing structures, and previously unknown ceremonial complexes that suggest the surface archaeology represents only a fraction of the island's cultural remains. These technological advances have fundamentally altered perceptions of Easter Island's complexity, while simultaneously generating new questions about the scope and sophistication of prehistoric Rapa Nui achievements. LiDAR technology deployed across Easter Island has produced detailed three-dimensional maps of the landscape that reveal subtle archaeological features invisible to conventional survey methods. These high-resolution topographic data have identified previously unknown road networks, agricultural terraces, and defensive structures that demonstrate far more extensive landscape modification than previously recognized. The LiDAR surveys have revealed that nearly the entire island surface bears evidence of human modification, including sophisticated water management systems, agricultural field boundaries, and settlement patterns that suggest population densities significantly higher than traditional estimates based on visible surface features. Geophysical investigations using magnetometry and electrical resistivity have identified subsurface anomalies that may represent buried structures, artifact concentrations, or geological features modified by human activity. These non-invasive techniques have proven particularly valuable for investigating areas around major ceremonial sites, where excavation would be culturally inappropriate or potentially damaging to existing monuments. The geophysical data have revealed complex subsurface patterns beneath AHU platforms that suggest multi-phase construction sequences and possible internal chambers or storage areas that were not apparent from surface observation alone. Recent excavations at Rano Raraku have fundamentally altered understanding of the moai statues by revealing that many of these monuments extend far below the current ground surface, with some specimens possessing fully carved bodies that had been buried by centuries of sediment accumulation. The excavation of Moai EU 21 revealed a complete statue standing over 20 feet tall, with elaborate petroglyphic decorations on the buried portions that had been perfectly preserved by the protective sediment layers. These discoveries demonstrate that the visible heads protruding from the Rano Raraku landscape represent only small portions of complete sculptures, dramatically altering calculations about the labour investment required for their creation. The application of photogrammetry and 3D scanning technologies has enabled precise documentation of moai dimensions, surface details, and carving techniques that provide new insights into the construction processes employed by Rapa Nui sculptors. High-resolution digital models reveal tool marks, surface textures, and proportional relationships that were previously difficult to measure and compare across different statues. These detailed records have identified subtle variations in carving styles that may reflect different time periods, workshop traditions, or individual sculptor preferences, providing new avenues for understanding the social organisation of monument construction activities. Experimental archaeology programs conducted by international research teams have tested various theories about moai transportation methods through full-scale replicas and traditional materials. The most significant breakthrough came through experiments led by Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo, who successfully demonstrated that moai could be walked upright using rope systems that rock the statues forward in controlled movements. Their experiments with a 5-ton replica showed that teams of 15, 20 people could move the statue along prepared pathways at speeds of approximately 100 meters per hour, supporting traditional oral histories that describe the moai as walking to their destinations. Alternative transportation experiments have continued to refine understanding of the various methods that may have been employed for moving moai across different terrain types and distances. Rolling techniques using wooden logs have proven effective for moving statues across relatively smooth surfaces, while sledding methods work well for traversing rougher terrain or areas where timber resources were limited. The experimental work has demonstrated that multiple transportation strategies were likely employed depending on specific circumstances, including statue size, route characteristics, available materials, and seasonal conditions. Radiocarbon dating programs utilizing improved analytical techniques and larger sample sizes have refined the chronological framework for Easter Island's cultural development, while revealing more complex patterns of cultural change than previously recognized. High-precision dating of charcoal samples from moai construction contexts has established that statue production began around 1250 AD and continued until approximately 1500 AD, with peak production occurring during the 14th and 15th centuries. The dating evidence indicates that moai construction was not a continuous process, but involved periods of intensive activity alternating with apparent hiatuses that may reflect social disruptions or resource limitations. Paleo-environmental reconstruction through pollen analysis, sediment core studies, and other proxy data has provided detailed information about environmental changes that occurred during human occupation of Easter Island. The most comprehensive studies, conducted by John Flenley and Sarah King, have revealed that deforestation proceeded more gradually than previously assumed, with forest clearance beginning around 1200 AD but not reaching completion until approximately 1650 AD. This extended timeline suggests that environmental degradation was a long-term process rather than a rapid ecological collapse, providing more time for human adaptation and resource management strategies. Botanical studies have identified the original composition of Easter Island's forest ecosystem through analysis of pollen samples, charcoal remains, and other plant materials preserved in archaeological and geological contexts. The research has confirmed that large palm trees dominated the original landscape, but has also revealed the presence of numerous other tree species, shrubs, and herbaceous plants that created a diverse forest environment. The identification of specific plant species has enabled researchers to reconstruct the resource base available to early settlers and understand how deforestation affected different aspects of the island's ecosystem. Genetic studies of modern Rapa Nui populations have provided insights into the demographic history and population structure of Easter Island's inhabitants, while addressing questions about potential contacts with other Pacific populations. Mitochondrial DNA analysis has confirmed Polynesian ancestry for the Rapa Nui people, while revealing genetic signatures that suggest the founding population included individuals from multiple Polynesian source areas. The genetic data support archaeological evidence for settlement around 1200 AD and indicate that the founding group was large enough to maintain genetic diversity despite the island's isolation. Recent genetic research has also identified traces of Native American ancestry in some Rapa Nui individuals, providing biological evidence for prehistoric contact between Easter Island and South America. The timing of this genetic admixture appears to predate European contact, supporting theories about trans-Pacific voyaging connections between Polynesia and the Americas. However, the extent and significance of these contacts remain subjects of ongoing debate, as the genetic evidence could reflect either Polynesian voyages to South America or American voyages to Easter Island. Archaeological investigations of agricultural systems have revealed sophisticated landscape management techniques that enabled intensive food production despite Easter Island's challenging environmental conditions. Excavations in inland areas have uncovered extensive networks of stone-lined gardens, terraced fields, and water management features that demonstrate detailed understanding of soil conservation and agricultural optimization. The agricultural systems incorporated techniques for protecting crops from wind damage, conserving soil moisture, and maintaining soil fertility through organic amendments and rotation practices. The discovery of elaborate stone mulch gardens covering thousands of acres across the island's interior has fundamentally altered understanding of Easter Island's agricultural capacity and population potential. These lithic mulch systems, created by placing layers of stones over agricultural areas, served multiple functions, including moisture retention, soil temperature regulation, and protection from wind erosion. Experimental studies have demonstrated that stone mulching can increase crop yields by 40 to 50% compared to unmulched fields, suggesting that Easter Island's agricultural productivity was much higher than previously estimated. Water management systems identified through recent archaeological research reveal sophisticated engineering solutions for capturing, storing, and distributing freshwater resources across the island. Excavations have uncovered stone-lined wells, underground cisterns, and channel systems that collected and directed rainfall runoff to agricultural areas and residential sites. These water management features demonstrate detailed understanding of hydrology and engineering principles that enabled sustainable habitation despite the island's limited freshwater resources. Ongoing debates within the academic community continue to focus on fundamental questions about Easter Island's demographic history, environmental trajectory, and cultural development patterns. Population estimates for the island's prehistoric maximum remain contentious, with different researchers proposing figures ranging from 3,000 to 20,000 inhabitants, based on varying interpretations of archaeological evidence and environmental carrying capacity calculations. The wide range in population estimates reflects uncertainties about agricultural productivity, settlement density, and the duration of peak occupation periods. The collapse narrative that dominated Easter Island scholarship for decades has come under increasing scrutiny as new evidence reveals more complex patterns of cultural change and environmental adaptation. Some researchers now argue that the traditional collapse model oversimplifies the island's cultural trajectory and fails to account for evidence of cultural continuity and adaptation during periods of environmental stress. Alternative interpretations emphasize resilience and innovation rather than catastrophic failure, pointing to evidence for successful adaptation to changing environmental conditions over several centuries. Current research into the Rongorongo script continues to generate new hypotheses about its origins, function, and relationship to other Pacific writing systems. Computer-assisted analysis of symbol patterns has identified statistical regularities that support the interpretation of Rongorongo as a genuine writing system rather than purely decorative art. However, the limited corpus of surviving texts and the absence of bilingual materials continues to prevent definitive decipherment, leaving fundamental questions about the script's linguistic content and cultural significance unresolved. Alternative theories about Rongorongo's development have gained attention from researchers who question the conventional assumption of independent invention on Easter Island. Some scholars propose connections between Rongorongo and other Pacific symbolic systems, including the Naxi script of southwestern China and various Melanesian symbolic traditions. These comparative studies suggest possible cultural contacts or shared ancestral traditions that might explain similarities between geographically distant symbolic systems. The extraterrestrial hypothesis for Easter Island's cultural development continues to attract attention from alternative researchers, despite the lack of credible scientific evidence supporting such interpretations. Proponents of ancient astronaut theories point to the precision of moai construction, the sophisticated astronomical alignments of ceremonial sites, and the apparent technological sophistication of various cultural achievements as evidence for extraterrestrial intervention. However, experimental archaeology and detailed technical analysis have demonstrated that all aspects of Rapa Nui cultural achievement fall within the capabilities of human societies using traditional technologies and organisational methods. Recent discoveries of previously unknown archaeological features continue to reveal new aspects of Easter Island's cultural complexity, while raising additional questions about the scope and sophistication of Rapa Nui civilization. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified possible underground chambers beneath major Ahu platforms, though excavation of these features has been limited by cultural protocols and conservation concerns. The potential existence of buried chambers or storage areas suggests that current understanding of Ahu construction and function may be incomplete. Petroglyphic studies using new documentation techniques have revealed thousands of previously unrecorded rock art images across Easter Island, demonstrating that symbolic expression was far more widespread than previously recognised. High-resolution photography and digital enhancement have revealed faded or weathered petroglyphs that provide new insights into Rapa Nui artistic traditions and symbolic systems. The petroglyphic corpus includes representations of moai, human figures, marine animals, and abstract designs that complement and extend the iconographic repertoire known from other artistic media. The application of stable isotope analysis to archaeological materials has provided new information about diet mobility patterns and resource exploitation strategies employed by Easter Island's inhabitants. Analysis of human bone collagen has revealed dietary patterns that changed over time, with evidence for increasing reliance on terrestrial resources and decreasing consumption of marine protein during later prehistoric periods. These isotopic signatures support archaeological evidence for environmental degradation and resource stress during the final phases of prehistoric occupation. Marine archaeology investigations around Easter Island have begun to explore underwater cultural resources that may preserve evidence of maritime activities and coastal adaptations. Preliminary surveys have identified possible harbour features, fish trap systems, and submerged archaeological deposits that could provide new insights into the maritime aspects of Rapa Nui culture. However, the challenging marine environment around Easter Island has limited the scope of underwater investigations, leaving significant potential for future discoveries. Current conservation efforts face complex challenges in balancing scientific research needs with cultural preservation requirements and tourism pressures. The increasing number of visitors to Easter Island creates ongoing threats to archaeological sites, while providing economic benefits that support local communities. Managing these competing demands requires careful coordination between researchers, cultural authorities, and tourism operators to ensure that scientific investigation and cultural preservation can continue alongside sustainable economic development. Climate change impacts on Easter Island's archaeological sites have become an increasing concern as rising sea levels, increased storm intensity, and changing precipitation patterns threaten coastal monuments and archaeological deposits. Many Ahu platforms located near the shoreline face ongoing erosion from wave action and storm surge, while changing rainfall patterns affect the preservation conditions of organic materials in archaeological contexts. Long-term monitoring programs have been established to track these environmental impacts and develop appropriate conservation responses. The integration of indigenous knowledge systems with scientific research methodologies has become an important focus for contemporary Easter Island studies. Collaboration between international researchers and Rapa Nui cultural practitioners has revealed traditional knowledge about landscape features, historical events, and cultural practices that complement and enhance scientific investigations. These collaborative approaches recognise the value of indigenous perspectives while respecting cultural protocols and community priorities. Modern research on Easter Island continues to reveal the remarkable achievements of Rapa Nui civilization, while demonstrating the complex interactions between human societies and island environments. The application of advanced technologies and interdisciplinary methodologies has expanded understanding of prehistoric Rapa Nui culture far beyond what was possible through traditional archaeological approaches alone. Yet fundamental questions remain unresolved, ensuring that Easter Island will continue to challenge researchers and capture public imagination for generations to come. The legacy of Easter Island extends far beyond its remarkable monuments to encompass lessons about human adaptability, environmental stewardship, and cultural resilience that remain relevant for contemporary global challenges. The Rapa Nui people's success in creating sophisticated civilization on one of the world's most isolated islands demonstrates the extraordinary capabilities of human societies to adapt and innovate under challenging conditions. Their subsequent struggles with environmental degradation, social conflict, and colonial exploitation provide sobering reminders about the fragility of human achievements and the importance of sustainable resource management. As research continues to unveil new aspects of Easter Island's cultural complexity and environmental history, the island's significance as a laboratory for understanding human-environment interactions becomes increasingly apparent. The combination of remarkable cultural achievements, environmental challenges, and ongoing mysteries ensures that Easter Island will remain one of the world's most fascinating archaeological sites, continuing to inspire new generations of researchers while preserving its enduring enigmas for future investigation.